Hey everyone, tonight we dive into one of the most incredible military campaigns in all of Westeros history. The story of how a single kingdom managed to do what seemed impossible. They defeated dragons, not just any dragons, but the mighty beasts that had conquered 6 entire kingdoms in just 2 years. The dragons that had melted Harrenhal's massive walls like candle wax. The same creatures that made kings kneel without a single battle. Yet in the burning sands of Dorne, these unstoppable forces met their match. This is the tale of Princess Meria Martell, the woman they called the Yellow Toad, who laughed in the face of dragonfire. The story of Queen Rhaenys the Conqueror, sister-wife to Aegon, who rode the great dragon Meraxes into battle after battle, only to meet her doom in the Dornish desert. And the mystery of how a kingdom without dragons, without great armies, without massive castles, managed to break the Targaryen war machine. But before we begin this epic journey through the sands of time, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the rich lore of Westeros. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our community spanning the globe. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on that fan for some gentle background sound. Pull up your blanket and settle in, because tonight's story is a long one, filled with political intrigue, impossible odds, and the kind of cunning that legends are made of. Imagine, if you will, the year 4 AC, Aegon the Conqueror sits on his new iron throne, forged from the swords of his enemies. 6 kingdoms have bent the knee. The realm seems united under Targaryen rule, but far to the south, in the desert kingdom of Dorne, an old woman sits in her tower, reading a message that demands her submission. Princess Meria Martell, 80 years old, weathered by decades of desert sun and political storms, does something that shocks even her own advisors. She laughs. Not a chuckle of amusement, but a deep, hearty laugh that echoes through the ancient halls of Sunspear. Then she does something even more shocking. She calls for fire, not to light a candle or warm her chambers, but to burn Aegon's letter. The letter that promises peace if she submits, destruction if she resists. But what Princess Meria knows, what she has spent her entire long life preparing for, is a secret that will shake the foundation of Targaryen power. A secret hidden in ancient texts, whispered in the forgotten corners of Dornish keeps, passed down through generations of desert warriors who remember the old ways. Dragons can die, and Meria Martell knows how to kill them. But how does one kill a dragon? How do you bring down a creature that can melt stone with its breath, that can soar above your armies and rain death from the sky? How do you defeat riders who have conquered the known world? The answer lies buried in the sands of Dorne, in tactics so audacious, so brilliantly simple, that they would redefine warfare itself. Tonight, we will uncover every secret, every strategy, every desperate gamble that turned the tide of history. We'll walk alongside the desert princes and princesses as they plan the impossible. We'll soar with Queen Rhaenys on her final flight. We'll witness the moment when the age of easy Targaryen conquest came to a sudden, shocking end. This is not just a story of war. It's a tale of how the seemingly weak can overcome the mighty through intelligence, patience, and an understanding of their enemy's greatest weakness. It's about the price of freedom and the cost of resistance, about ancient grudges and impossible odds, about the moment when dragons learn to fear. So settle back and let the story begin, because tonight we return to a time when the fate of Westeros hung in the balance. When the unconquerable met the unbreakable, and when the desert sands ran red with dragon blood. Our story unfolds in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of Dorne, the southernmost kingdom of Westeros, during the years 4 to 37 after conquest. This is a land unlike any other in the 7 kingdoms, where the north has its ice and snow, where the Reach has its green fields and flowing rivers, Dorne has something far more precious and far more dangerous. It has secrets hidden in its burning sands. Dorne is a kingdom of 3 distinct regions, each with its own character, its own people, and its own role in the coming war. In the east lies the sandy Dorne, centered around Sunspear, seat of House Martell. Here the great desert stretches endlessly, broken only by hidden oases and ancient ruins. The people here are descendants of the Rhoynar, the water wizards who fled the dragon lords of Valyria 1,000 years before Aegon's conquest. They brought with them customs unknown in the rest of Westeros. Women inherit equally with men, lovers are chosen freely, and most importantly, they remember the old ways of war against dragons. To the west lies the rocky Dorne, dominated by the ancient seat of Euronwood, where the mountains rise like stone titans against the desert sky. The Euronwoods style themselves the Blood Royal, claiming descent from the ancient kings who ruled before Nymeria's arrival. Here the castles are built into the living rock, their halls carved from mountain stone, their walls standing testament to centuries of desert warfare. The people of the rocky Dorne are harder, more traditional, clinging to the old Dornish ways, while eyeing their Martell overlords with barely concealed resentment. Finally, along the southern coast stretches the Salt Dorne, where House Dolt holds sway from their seat at Lemonwood. Here the desert meets the summer sea, and the people make their living from salt and spice, from the exotic goods that flow through the narrow sea from the free cities beyond. The coastal lords know the value of patience, of waiting for the right tide, the right wind, the right moment to strike. It is into this complex web of desert politics and ancient grudges that we must venture to understand how Dorne accomplished the impossible. At the heart of it all sits one remarkable woman, Princess Meria Martell, the Yellow Toad of Dorne. Do not let the cruel nickname fool you. Meria Martell is perhaps the most formidable ruler of her generation, a woman who has survived 80 years of desert politics, family intrigue, and the constant threat of invasion from more powerful neighbors. She earned her epithet not from any physical deformity, but from her ability to remain perfectly still, perfectly patient, until the moment comes to strike. Like a desert toad waiting by a waterhole, she can remain motionless for hours, days, even years, gathering strength for the perfect moment to act. When we first encounter Princess Meria in the year 4 AC, she is a woman shaped by a lifetime of careful observation and patient planning. Her face is weathered by 8 decades of desert sun, her hair white as sun-bleached bone, her eyes the dark gold of ancient amber. She moves slowly now, her joints stiff with age, but her mind remains as sharp as a Dornish spear point. She has seen the rise and fall of kings, has weathered invasions and rebellions, has buried husbands and children and rivals, and through it all she has endured. Meria's court is a reflection of Dorne itself, diverse and complex, filled with competing loyalties and ancient grievances. At her right hand stands her daughter and heir, Princess Meria Martell, a woman of 45 with her mother's cunning and her father's skill with a blade. Meria has spent her life preparing for this moment, studying the arts of war and diplomacy, learning the subtle dance of desert politics. She knows that one day she will inherit not just Sunspear, but the burden of keeping Dorne free. Among Meria's most trusted advisors is Lord Anders Euronwood, the blood royal of rocky Dorne. Anders is a proud man, descended from ancient kings, who chafes under Martell rule, but recognizes the greater threat posed by Targaryen conquest. He brings to Meria's council the loyalty of the mountain lords and the knowledge of the old ways of warfare. His people have been fighting in these deserts for 1,000 years, and they know every hidden pass, every secret water source, every cave where an army might hide. Then there is Sir Davos, Dane of Starfall, wielder of the ancestral sword Dorne, forged from the heart of a fallen star. The Danes are an ancient house, older even than the Martells, and their loyalty has always been complex. They remember when Dorne was many kingdoms, not one, and their seat in the Western Mountains gives them a unique perspective on the coming conflict. Davos himself is torn between his duty to Dorne and his recognition that Targaryen rule might bring peace to a land long plagued by warfare. These are the key players in our drama, but they are far from the only ones. In the halls of Sunspear, in the mountain fortresses of Euronwood, in the coastal palaces of the Salt Dawn, dozens of noble houses are making their own preparations, choosing their own sides, weighing their own chances of survival in the coming storm. What makes this moment so crucial, what gives our story its terrible urgency, is the knowledge that everywhere else in Westeros, resistance has already crumbled. Aegon the Conqueror has swept through 6 kingdoms in just 2 years. The Storm Kings bent the knee after seeing Harrenhal's melted towers. The kings of the Rock surrendered rather than face dragonfire. The proud kings of the North chose submission over extinction. One by one, the ancient royal lines have fallen, their crowns melted down to become part of Aegon's Iron Throne. But Dorne is different. Dorne has always been different. Here, in this land of sand and secrets, ancient knowledge still survives. Here, the descendants of the Rhoynar remember what their ancestors learned in their wars against Valyria. Here, the old ways of fighting dragons have been preserved, passed down through generations of desert warriors who never forgot that even the mightiest beasts can fall. Princess Meria sits in her tower chamber, surrounded by maps and letters, by ancient books written in the flowing script of old Rhoynar, by weapons that have tasted dragon blood. She knows what is coming. She has known for years, ever since the first reports reached her of a silver-haired conqueror landing at the mouth of the Blackwater with 3 great dragons. She has been preparing, planning, gathering allies and resources for this inevitable confrontation. Outside her windows, the desert stretches endlessly toward the horizon, its surface shimmering with heat, its depths hiding secrets that even the dragons cannot reach. This is her kingdom, her weapon, her greatest ally in the war to come. In its burning sands lie the bones of armies that underestimated Dorne. In its hidden oases wait the warriors who will teach the Targaryens the price of conquest. The stage is set. The players are in position, and far to the north, 3 dragons are preparing to fly south, carrying with them the full might of Targaryen ambition and the terrible certainty of their own invincibility. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when the Raven arrived at Sunspear. Its black wings beat wearily against the desert air, carrying with it a message that would change the course of Westerosi history forever. The bird bore the 3-headed dragon seal of House Targaryen, pressed deep into red wax that had already begun to soften in the intense Dornish heat. Princess Meria received the letter in her private chambers, high in the spear tower that gave Sunspear its name. The room was cool despite the blazing sun outside, its thick stone walls providing blessed relief from the desert heat. Ancient Rhoynar tapestries covered the walls, depicting the great water magic of her ancestors, while beneath her feet lay carpets woven with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like the rivers of old Rhoynar. She broke the seal with steady fingers, though at 80 years of age, those fingers were gnarled with arthritis and spotted with the marks of time. The parchment crackled as she unfolded it, and for a long moment, the only sound in the chamber was the whisper of wind through the narrow windows and the distant call of gulls from the harbor below. The message was brief, as befitted a conqueror. Aegon the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm, called upon Princess Meria to submit to his rule. The letter spoke of the swift conquest of the other kingdoms, of the wisdom of peaceful surrender, of the generous terms offered to those who bent the knee willingly rather than face the wrath of dragons. What the letter did not mention, what Aegon perhaps did not fully understand, was that he was writing to a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Meria had been born in the year 76 before the conquest, when Aegon was not even a dream in his father's mind. She had lived through the reign of 6 different Storm Kings. She had seen the rise and fall of a dozen petty kings in the Reach. She had watched the wars between the Rock and the Riverlands with the calculating eye of someone who understood that all kingdoms eventually faced their moment of ultimate testing. More importantly, she had access to knowledge that Aegon could never imagine. In the deepest vaults of Sunspear, in chambers sealed since the days of Princess Meria herself, lay texts written in the flowing script of old Rhoynar. These were not mere histories or poetry, but practical manuals of war, written by the survivors of Valyria's expansion eastward. The Rhoynar had fought dragons before. They had learned through terrible cost and bitter experience how these seemingly invincible creatures could be brought low. The secret was not in matching strength with strength. The Valyrians had built their empire on the simple principle that nothing could stand against dragonfire, that no army could face the terror from the sky and emerge victorious. They were wrong, but the price of proving them wrong had been the destruction of the Rhoynar cities and the exodus of an entire people across the narrow sea. Yet knowledge survived. Hidden in ancient texts, whispered in family traditions, preserved in the old songs that mothers sang to their children, the techniques lived on. Not just the physical methods of dragon killing, though those were vital, but the deeper understanding of how dragons thought, how they hunted, how their riders commanded them. The Rhoynar texts spoke of dragons as creatures of pride and habit, following patterns that could be predicted and exploited by patient enemies. Meria rose from her chair and walked to the window, still holding Aegon's letter in her weathered hands. Below her the city of Sunspear sprawled along the coast, its whitewashed buildings gleaming like pearls in the morning sun. The harbor was busy with merchant ships from Tyrosh and Lys, their holds filled with spices and silks and the 1,000 exotic goods that flowed through Dorne's ports. This was her city, her people, her responsibility. She thought of her grandsons, young Prince Nymor and his brother Mors, both still children, but already showing the fierce pride of their Martell blood. She thought of the loyal lords who served her house, men like Anders Yeronwood, who had set aside ancient grudges to stand with Dorne against foreign conquest. She thought of the common folk who looked to her for protection, the fishermen and farmers and craftsmen who had never asked for war but would suffer most terribly if it came to their shores. Yet she also thought of freedom, of the right to rule themselves as they had for 1,000 years. Of the ancient promise made by Princess Meria when she united the scattered Dornish kingdoms under Martell rule. That promise spoke of a land where no foreign king would dictate terms, where the old ways would endure, where the desert itself would rise up to defend its children. The decision, when it came, surprised no one who truly knew Meria Martell. She called for her maester, a scholarly man named Hellyweg, who had served her house faithfully for 30 years. When he arrived, ink-stained and slightly out of breath from hurrying up the tower stairs, she handed him Aegon's letter without a word. Maester Hellyweg read it carefully, his face growing pale as he absorbed the implications. When he finished, he looked up at his princess with eyes full of questions and barely concealed fear. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "this is not a request. This is an ultimatum." Meria smiled, and there was something in that smile that reminded observers why she was called the Yellow Toad. It was the patient, predatory expression of a creature that had learned to wait, to endure, to strike only when victory was assured. "Indeed it is, Maester. King Aegon has made his position quite clear. We are to submit or face the consequences." She paused, looking out at her city once more. "Bring me fire." The maester blinked in confusion. "Your Grace." "Fire, Hellyweg. A candle, a torch, whatever you have to hand. I have a letter to burn." As the parchment curled and blackened in the flame, releasing the sweet scent of burning wax and paper, Meria felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. This was the moment she had trained for, planned for, prepared her entire kingdom to face. The dragons were coming to Dorne, carrying with them all the terrible might of Targaryen ambition. But dragons, as her ancestors had learned through blood and sacrifice, were not gods. They were beasts, magnificent and terrible, but still mortal. They could burn and rage and inspire terror, but they could also be outthought, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated by enemies who understood their weaknesses. That evening, as the sun set over the summer sea in a blaze of orange and gold, Princess Meria called her war council to assemble. Lords from across Dorne began arriving at Sunspear, riding hard through the desert night to answer their princess's summons. They came not knowing what fate awaited them, but understanding that history itself hung in the balance. In the great hall of Sunspear, beneath banners bearing the red sun and spear of House Martell Meria, stood before the assembled lords of Dorne and spoke the words that would echo through history. "Aegon Targaryen calls himself King of the Seven Kingdoms," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "He has forgotten that Dorne was never conquered by his ancestors, and it will not be conquered now. We are the unbowed, unbent, unbroken. Let him come with his dragons and his armies. He will find that the desert has teeth." The roar of approval that arose from the assembled lords seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient castle. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, cold and distant witnesses to a decision that would reshape the destiny of Westeros forever. War had come to Dorne, and Dorne was ready. The Great War Council of Dorne convened for 3 days and 3 nights, and what transpired within those ancient walls would become the foundation of the most audacious military campaign in Westerosi history. Lords who had feuded for generations set aside their differences. Ancient houses that had nursed grudges since the time of Princess Nymeria found common cause. The rocky Dorne, the sandy Dorne, and the salt Dorne united as they had not done for centuries. Lord Anders Euronwood arrived on the second day, his weathered face grim beneath his iron-grey hair. The blood royal of rocky Dorne brought with him troubling news from the northern borders. Targaryen scouts had been seen in the Dornish marches, testing the mountain passes, probing for weaknesses. More concerning still, ravens had brought word that Lord Orys Baratheon, Aegon's bastard brother and fiercest general, was already marshalling forces at Storm's End for what could only be an invasion of Dorne. "They mean to come at us from the north," Anders reported to the assembled council. "Baratheon commands 20,000 men, perhaps more. Good soldiers, battle-tested from the conquest of the Stormlands, and behind them rides the Dragon King himself, with Balerion the Black Dread." Princess Meria leaned forward in her chair, studying the crude map spread across the oak table. At 45, she possessed her mother's sharp mind housed in a warrior's body. Years of training in the Dornish style of combat had given her a lean, dangerous grace that reminded many observers of a desert viper coiled to strike. 20,000 men crossing the mountains, she mused. They'll need to move slowly, keep their supply lines intact. The passes are narrow, easily defended. She looked up at Anders with calculating eyes. "What of your mountain lords? Are they prepared?" Anders nodded grimly. "Every castle from Kingsgrave to the Boneway is ready. We've been preparing for this day since word first reached us of Harrenhal's fall. But Meria, we cannot stop them forever with conventional tactics. Eventually sheer numbers will tell, and when the dragons come..." He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone in the chamber understood. Dragons changed everything. No castle walls could withstand dragonfire. No army could stand against the terror from above. This was why 6 kingdoms had fallen so quickly, why ancient royal lines had bent the knee rather than face extinction. But Princess Meria had been strangely quiet throughout these discussions, listening carefully but contributing little. Now she rose from her chair at the head of the table, her movement slow but purposeful. At 80 years old, she no longer possessed the physical vigor of her youth, but her mind remained as sharp as a newly forged blade. "My lords," she said, and her voice carried the authority of decades of rule. "You speak of defending passes and manning castle walls. These are the tactics of yesterday's wars. The dragons have made such strategies obsolete." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We will not fight them as they expect to be fought." Sir Davos Dane of Starfall, his pale hair catching the lamplight, spoke up from his place at the table. "Your Grace, if we cannot defend our strongholds, how do we propose to resist? Dorne's strength has always lain in our castles and our knowledge of the terrain." Meria smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Our castles will be empty when they arrive, Sir Davos. Our armies will have vanished like morning mist. When Aegon and his dragons come to Dorne, they will find a kingdom of ghosts." The strategy that emerged over those 3 days was unlike anything seen before in Westerosi warfare. It required a complete reimagining of how wars were fought, a willingness to sacrifice everything familiar and comfortable in pursuit of ultimate victory. Most importantly, it demanded a level of coordination and trust between the Dornish houses that had never before existed. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity. When the Targaryen forces crossed into Dorne, they would find the border castles abandoned but intact. No great battles would be fought at the Boneway or Prince's Pass. No heroic last stands would mark the invasion's beginning. Instead, the Dornish forces would simply disappear, melting away into the deep desert like water seeping into sand. Lord Corgiel of Sandstone would lead his forces into the deep wastes of the central desert, taking with them supplies cached over months of preparation. House Ula of Hellholt would abandon their ancient seat and fade into the rocky Badlands to the east. The coastal lords would take to their ships, becoming sea raiders striking at Targaryen supply lines from hidden bases among the islands. Every castle would be stripped of value before abandonment. Gold and jewels would be buried in secret locations. Weapons and armor would be distributed among the common folk or hidden in desert caches. Food stores would be poisoned or destroyed. The Targaryens would inherit empty shells, their conquest yielding nothing but dust and stone. But the true genius of the plan lay not in what the Dornish would abandon, but in what they would preserve. Deep in the desert, far from any roads or water sources that an invading army might follow, a shadow kingdom would take shape. Hidden camps connected by secret paths, known only to the desert-born, supply networks maintained by nomad tribes who could navigate by stars and read the stories told by shifting sands. Princess Meria assigned specific roles to each of her great houses. The Rhoynar, with their intimate knowledge of the mountain passes, would serve as the kingdom's eyes and ears, watching the northern borders and reporting on Targaryen movements. Their castle might fall, but their people would retreat to mountain caves and hidden valleys, emerging only to strike at enemy supply lines. House Dane would coordinate with the Western lords, using their ancient connections to the Reach to gather intelligence, and perhaps even foment rebellion behind enemy lines. Starfall's position near the border made it perfect for monitoring Targaryen communications and intercepting their ravens. The Ulas and Corgyles, masters of desert warfare, would become the spear point of resistance. Their warriors knew every hidden spring, every cave system, every place where an army might shelter from the killing heat of the Dornish sun. They would be the ones to teach the dragons fear. As the council sessions continued, details emerged that spoke to months of careful preparation. Scout networks had already been established throughout the kingdom. Supply caches had been hidden in dozens of locations, stocked with water, food, weapons, and medical supplies. Coded signals using mirror flashes and smoke columns would allow rapid communication across vast distances. Most crucially, Princess Meria, revealed the existence of the ancient Rhoynar texts hidden deep beneath Sunspear. For the first time in 1,000 years, the dragon-fighting knowledge of her ancestors would be put to practical use. The techniques described in those moldering scrolls would be adapted for Dornish conditions, tested in secret, and refined through careful study. On the final night of the council, as the lords prepared to return to their seats and begin the great evacuation, Princess Meria hosted a feast in the great hall of Sunspear. It was a somber affair, despite the rich food and flowing wine. Everyone present understood that this might be the last time they gathered in these ancient halls. The next time they met, it would be in some hidden desert camp, under stars instead of painted ceilings. The princess rose to address her vassals one final time. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the emotion that must have been churning within her breast. "My lords," she said, "when our ancestors came to these shores with Princess Nymeria, they brought with them the wisdom of a great civilization. The Rhoynar did not build their power on conquest or domination, but on understanding. They understood the rivers, the seasons, the ebb and flow of political power. That understanding allowed them to survive the destruction of their homeland and build something new here in Dorne." She paused, looking around the hall at faces both familiar and dear. Some of these men she had known since they were boys. Others had served her father before her. All had sworn their lives to the defense of Dorne's independence. "Now we face our greatest test," she continued. "Dragons have come to our shores, bearing conquerors who believe themselves invincible. They have never failed because they have never truly been tested. The other kingdoms fell quickly because they fought the war their enemies wanted to fight. We will not make that mistake." The evacuation began the next morning. From castles across Dorne, long columns of refugees began their journey into the deep desert. They traveled at night when possible, following routes planned months in advance, guided by stars and the ancient knowledge of the desert tribes. It was a migration unlike anything in Dornish history, an entire kingdom pulling up its roots and disappearing into the wasteland. Yet even as the great castles emptied, activity continued in the hidden places. In sea caves along the coast, shipwrights worked by torchlight to modify fishing vessels into raiders. In desert canyons, smiths forged spears with specialized points designed to punch through dragon scale. In mountain caves, alchemists mixed compounds that would burn even underwater, inspired by half-remembered Rhoynar formulas. The kingdom of Dorne was transforming itself, shedding the familiar forms of feudal warfare like a snake shedding its skin. What would emerge from this metamorphosis was something entirely new in Westerosi military history. A phantom kingdom that existed wherever its people gathered. An army that was everywhere and nowhere, striking without warning and vanishing without trace. As the last wagons disappeared into the desert dawn, Princess Meria stood alone on the battlements of Sunspear, looking north toward the distant mountains beyond which her enemies gathered. Soon those mountains would disgorge armies and dragons, confident in their inevitable victory. They would find Dorne exactly as they expected, a desert kingdom of ancient castles and proud lords. What they would not find, until it was far too late, was that the desert itself had become their enemy. The invasion of Dorne began exactly as Princess Meria had predicted. Lord Orys Baratheon, bastard brother to King Aegon, led his army through the Boneway in the spring of 4 AC, with all the confidence of a conqueror who had never known defeat. Behind him marched 20,000 men, veterans of the campaigns that had brought the Stormlands to heel. Their banners flew proudly in the desert wind, the crowned stag of Baratheon, alongside the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. What they found waiting for them defied every expectation of civilized warfare. The great fortress of Wyle, guardian of the Boneway, stood open and empty. Its massive gates hung wide, its towers unmanned, its halls echoing with nothing but wind. No defenders lined the battlements. No arrows flew from murder holes, no challenges rang out from horn or herald. Corys rode through the gates of Wile with a growing sense of unease. He had expected a siege, had brought engines and siege towers to reduce the castle's mighty walls. Instead, he found himself the master of a prize that felt more like a trap than a conquest. His men spread through the empty chambers, their voices hushed as they searched for some sign of the garrison that should have been there. The castle's stores had been stripped clean, but not hastily. Every chamber showed signs of careful, methodical evacuation. Valuable tapestries had been removed, but the heavy furniture remained. Personal belongings were gone, but the castle's basic infrastructure was intact and undamaged. It was as if the defenders had simply chosen to leave, taking with them everything portable and valuable while leaving behind an empty shell. More troubling still were the messages they found carved into stone walls throughout the castle, written in the common tongue. But following Dornish poetic forms, these inscriptions spoke of patience and endurance, of deserts that swallowed armies and sands that covered the bones of invaders. One message found in the castle's great hall would haunt Orys for months to come. The sun rises and sets, the desert endures. What the sand claims, the sand keeps forever. Similar discoveries awaited the Targaryen forces at every stronghold they approached. Blackhaven fell without resistance, its lord nowhere to be found. Kingsgrave stood empty, its ancient towers silent as tombs. Castle after castle yielded to the invaders without a fight, each conquest feeling more hollow than the last. Yet it was not entirely bloodless. The Targaryens began to experience losses almost immediately. Though not from any conventional military action, sentries would vanish in the night, leaving behind only their armor and weapons arranged in neat piles. Supply wagons traveling between captured castles would arrive at their destinations empty, their guards found unconscious and unharmed, but with no memory of what had befallen them. Worse, the desert itself seemed hostile to their presence. Water sources that local guides assured them were reliable would be found poisoned or filled with sand. Roads that appeared clear and safe would give way to hidden sinkholes that swallowed men and horses. The very air seemed to shimmer with malevolent heat, making accurate estimation of distances impossible and turning every march into a trial of endurance. Lord Orys, experienced commander though he was, found himself facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. These were not the honorable knights of the Stormlands who would meet him in open battle. These were not even the desperate defenders of Harrenhal who had at least tried to hold their walls against dragonfire. This was something entirely different, an opponent that refused to present itself for defeat. His frustration grew with each passing day. Reports from his scouts painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The entire population of eastern Dorne seemed to have vanished. Villages stood empty but undamaged. Farms showed signs of recent habitation but no inhabitants. It was as if an entire people had simply decided to stop existing, leaving behind only the physical evidence of their lives. 3 weeks into the campaign, as Orys established his headquarters in the captured fortress of Euronwood, he received his first concrete intelligence about Dornish movements. A patrol returning from a scouting mission reported seeing smoke signals rising from the deep desert, complex patterns that suggested some form of communication network. More intriguingly, they had glimpsed riders in the distance, mounted figures who appeared and vanished like mirages, always staying just beyond the range of pursuit. It was then that Orys began to understand the true nature of his enemy. The Dornish had not fled in panic or desperation. They had implemented a strategy so alien to conventional warfare that it had taken him weeks to recognize it for what it was. They had transformed their entire kingdom into a weapon, turning every mile of desert, every hidden canyon, every shifting dune into a potential threat. The realization coincided with the arrival of disturbing reports from his supply lines. The road between Euronwood and the Boneway, supposedly secure and well patrolled, had been the site of 3 separate attacks in as many days. In each case, supply convoys had been struck by raiders who appeared without warning, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before any organized response could be mounted. The attacks followed no pattern that Orys could discern. Sometimes the raiders struck at dawn, emerging from the morning mist like vengeful spirits. Other times they came in the heat of midday, using the blazing sun and shimmering air to mask their approach. Most unsettling of all were the night raids, when Dornish fighters seemed to melt out of the very darkness, striking like shadows and disappearing just as quickly. What made these attacks truly terrifying was their restraint. The Dornish raiders could have slaughtered the supply convoy guards, but they rarely did. Instead, they left their enemies unconscious or bound, taking weapons and supplies but sparing lives. It was a calculated mercy that served a dual purpose, showing that the raiders were in complete control of each engagement, while simultaneously denying the Targaryens the righteous anger that came from avenging fallen comrades. As the reports accumulated on his desk, Orys began to piece together a picture of his invisible enemy. The raiders were not a single force, but rather dozens of small groups operating independently across a vast area. They possessed detailed knowledge of every water source, every defensible position, every hidden path through the maze of canyons and badlands that made up the Dornish interior. More troubling still, they seemed to possess an intelligence network of remarkable sophistication. The raiders always knew exactly when and where supply convoys would be most vulnerable. They struck at moments when patrols were elsewhere. When guards were tired, when weather conditions favored concealment. It was as if they could see through his eyes, anticipating his decisions before he made them. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of his captured prisoners, a young Dornish woman found among the raiders who had struck a supply convoy near Blackhaven, proved more forthcoming than her companions when questioned. She spoke of mirror signals that could carry messages across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours, of desert tribes whose children learned to read the movement of sand and wind like written words, of a communication system that had been refined over centuries of desert warfare. "You march through our land," she told Orys, with a mixture of pity and defiance in her voice, "but you do not see it. Every grain of sand carries a message. Every shift of wind brings word of your movements. You are not conquerors here. You are guests in our house, and we know everything you do." It was then that Orys understood the true scope of what he faced. This was not a rebellion or a desperate last stand. This was a kingdom that had spent generations preparing for this moment, that had transformed itself into something unprecedented in Westerosi military history. The Dornish had become a people without fixed positions, without vulnerable strongholds, without any of the conventional weaknesses that had doomed the other kingdoms. Yet even as he grappled with this realization, more disturbing news arrived. His scouts reported strange weather patterns in the deep desert, unnatural fogs that rose without apparent cause, sandstorms that struck with sudden violence before dissipating just as quickly. Some of his men whispered of Dornish sorcery, of ancient Rhoynar magics that could command the very elements. Orys dismissed such talk as superstition, born of frustration and heat exhaustion. But he could not entirely shake his own growing unease. There were too many coincidences, too many perfectly timed natural phenomena that seemed to favor his enemies. Whether through magic or simply superior knowledge of their homeland, the Dornish possessed advantages that no conventional military force could match. As summer deepened and the desert heat became a living thing that pressed down upon his army like a great weight, Orys found himself facing a terrible choice. He could continue his advance into the deep desert, pursuing an enemy that refused to be caught, while his forces slowly bled away through ambush and attrition. Or he could consolidate his position in the captured border castles and wait for King Aegon to arrive with the dragons. The decision was made for him when word arrived that would change everything. A raven bearing the Targaryen seal brought news that made his blood run cold. Queen Rhaenys was coming to Dorne aboard her dragon Meraxes, intent on ending the resistance through dragonfire where conventional armies had failed. As Orys read the message by lamplight in his chambers atop Euron Wood, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. He had campaigned with Rhaenys before, had seen her in battle atop her great silver dragon. She was brave to the point of recklessness, eager to prove herself the equal of her brother-husband in warfare. Against conventional enemies, her arrival would mean swift and certain victory. But the Dornish had already proven they were anything but conventional. They had found ways to make his 20,000 seasoned warriors feel lost and helpless in their own conquered territory. What horrors might they have prepared for a dragon and its rider? Outside his window, the desert stretched endlessly toward the southern horizon, its sands holding secrets that had been 1,000 years in the making. Somewhere out there, in hidden camps and forgotten places, Princess Meria was preparing for the next phase of her impossible war. The dragons were coming to Dorne, exactly as she had always known they would. And in the ancient vaults beneath the abandoned castles, in the secret places where Rhoynar wisdom still held sway, the true weapons of this war waited to be unleashed. Queen Rhaenys Targaryen arrived in Dorne with all the terrible majesty that had conquered 6 kingdoms. Meraxes, her silver dragon, cast a shadow across the desert that seemed to swallow the very light from the sky. The great beast's wingspan stretched nearly 200 feet from tip to tip, and when she roared her challenge to the empty castles below, the sound echoed off canyon walls like the voice of some primordial god awakening from slumber. The queen herself was a vision of Valyrian beauty and martial prowess. At 29 years old, she possessed the silver-gold hair and violet eyes of her ancient bloodline. But there was steel beneath that ethereal beauty. She had fought beside her brother-husband Aegon in every major battle of the conquest, had seen the great lords of Westeros kneel before dragonfire, had watched ancient dynasties crumble to ash at her command. When Meraxes descended upon the captured fortress of Euron Wood, where Lord Orys had established his headquarters, the very stones seemed to tremble. The dragon's landing in the castle's great courtyard sent up clouds of dust and scattered the few remaining horses that had not already fled in terror. Soldiers who had faced the greatest knights of the Stormlands without flinching found themselves unable to meet the ancient, intelligent gaze of the silver dragon. Rhaenys dismounted with fluid grace, her riding leathers dusty from the long flight south. She surveyed the empty castle with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the abandoned battlements, the silent halls, the eerie absence of any sign of recent battle. When she spoke to Orys, her voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to reshaping the world through force of will. "Brother," she said, using the term of affection she had always employed for Aegon's bastard, half-brother. "I expected to find you celebrating another swift victory. Instead, I find you brooding in an empty castle like some melancholy prince from an old song." Orys emerged from the keep's main hall, his face grim despite the relief he felt at seeing reinforcements arrive. 3 months of desert warfare had aged him visibly. His dark hair now showed streaks of premature gray, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had learned to sleep lightly, always listening for sounds that might herald another mysterious attack. "Your Grace," he replied, with a formal courtesy he maintained even in private conversation. "Dorne is not like the other kingdoms. The enemy refuses to present himself for battle. We hold every major stronghold from the Boneway to Euron, yet we control nothing beyond these castle walls." Rhaenys studied him with the calculating gaze of a born tactician. She had heard the reports, of course, had read the increasingly frustrated dispatches that Orys had sent north to King's Landing. But seeing the reality firsthand was different. This was not the orderly conquest she had expected, not the swift submission that had marked their victories elsewhere. "Show me," she commanded simply. Over the following days, Rhaenys and Meraxes conducted an aerial reconnaissance of the territory that Orys claimed to have conquered. What she saw from Dragonback only confirmed the strange nature of this campaign. The captured castles stood like islands of Targaryen control in a sea of empty wilderness. Roads that should have been busy with trade and travel lay abandoned. Villages that should have housed thousands showed no signs of recent habitation. Yet there were signs, for those with eyes to see them. Smoke columns rose from the deep desert in patterns too regular to be natural. Flashes of reflected sunlight from hidden mirrors created a constellation of signals across the wasteland. Most tellingly, there were always riders visible in the distance, mounted figures who watched and waited but never approached close enough to be engaged. Rhaenys found herself experiencing something she had rarely known during the conquest: uncertainty. Every previous campaign had followed a predictable pattern. Fly over the enemy stronghold, demonstrate the power of dragonfire, accept the inevitable surrender. The sight of Meraxes descending from the sky had been enough to break the will of every army they had faced. But there were no armies visible here to be broken. The Dornish had simply vanished, taking with them everything that made conquest meaningful. What use was it to burn empty castles? How could Dragonfire cow an enemy who refused to present himself for intimidation? Still, Rhaenys was not without resources. On her 4th day in Dorne, she received intelligence that seemed to offer a solution to the puzzle. A captured Dornish scout, taken during a failed raid on a supply convoy, had revealed under questioning that Princess Meria Martell was still alive and reportedly hiding in the ruins of an ancient Rhoynar city deep in the central desert. The location was called Meraxes, according to the prisoner, one of the forgotten cities that Princess Meria's people had built during their early years in Dorne. It lay 3 days' flight south of Euronwood, in a region so desolate that even the nomad tribes avoided it. If the intelligence was accurate, striking at Meraxes would decapitate the Dornish resistance at a single blow. Rhaenys felt the familiar thrill of impending victory as she planned her attack. This was more like the warfare she understood, with clear objectives and decisive action. Meraxes could cover the distance to Nyser in a fraction of the time it would take ground forces to traverse the same terrain. A swift strike from the air would eliminate the Dornish leadership before they could scatter again. The flight south revealed a landscape of surreal beauty and terrible harshness. The central Dornish desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its red sands marked by wind-carved rock formations that rose like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. The heat was intense even at altitude, and Rhaenys found herself grateful for the cooling effect of Meraxes' flight speed. As they approached the coordinates provided by their prisoner, the ruins of Nyser emerged from the desert haze like a mirage made manifest. The ancient city had once been magnificent, its towers and domes reflecting sophisticated Rhoynar architectural principles. Now it stood partially buried by centuries of shifting sand, its broken walls creating a maze of shadows and hidden spaces. More importantly, there were clear signs of recent habitation. Smoke rose from carefully concealed fires. Horses could be seen picketed in the shelter of ruined buildings. Armed figures moved among the ancient stones with the purposeful activity of a military encampment. This was exactly what Rhaenys had hoped to find, a concentrated target worthy of dragonfire. Meraxes descended in a spiral that would bring her within optimal range of the ruins. The dragon's shadow fell across Nyser like a dark prophecy, and Rhaenys could see the figures below scattering in apparent panic. Some ran for the deeper ruins, seeking shelter among the ancient stones. Others seemed to freeze in place, paralyzed by the sight of approaching doom. The attack, when it came, was devastating in its precision. Meraxes breathed silver fire that turned sand to glass and stone to powder. Ancient walls that had stood for centuries crumbled in moments. The carefully concealed camps burst into flame, sending billowing clouds of smoke into the desert sky. Within minutes, Nyasai had been transformed from a hidden refuge into a burning wasteland. As Meraxes circled the devastation, Rhaenys felt the satisfaction of a clean victory. Hundreds of Dornish fighters had been eliminated in the attack, along with what appeared to be their primary command structure. Among the confirmed dead was an elderly woman whose rich clothing and obvious authority marked her as someone of considerable importance, quite possibly Princess Meria herself. The return flight to Urinewood was triumphant. Rhaenys brought with her not only the news of a successful strike, but also captured banners and weapons that seemed to confirm the destruction of organized Dornish resistance. The Silver Spear and Red Sun of House Martell, recovered from the ruins, served as tangible proof that the rebellion's leadership had been broken. Lord Orys received the news with evident relief. For 3 months he had been fighting shadows and mirages, chasing an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere. The destruction of Nisar offered concrete evidence that the Dornish could be brought to battle and defeated like any other foe. In the days that followed, this impression seemed to be confirmed by events on the ground. The mysterious raids on supply convoys ceased entirely. The mirror signals that had flashed across the desert fell silent. Patrols ventured further from their bases without encountering resistance. Most tellingly, refugees began appearing at the captured castles, Dornish civilians who claimed to have fled their hidden camps after learning of their princess's death. These refugees painted a picture of a resistance movement collapsing under the weight of its leader's demise. They spoke of disagreements among the surviving lords, of younger commanders arguing for surrender while older advisors insisted on continuing a now hopeless struggle. Most encouragingly, they provided detailed intelligence about the locations of remaining Dornish camps, information that allowed Targaryen forces to begin systematic operations against the scattered remnants. Rhaenys found herself the toast of the combined Targaryen forces in Dorne. Officers who had grown cynical after months of fruitless campaigning now spoke enthusiastically of the swift conclusion of the war. Messages flew north to King's Landing, carrying news of victory and the imminent pacification of the last independent kingdom in Westeros. Yet beneath the surface celebration, troubling details began to emerge. The elderly woman killed at Nyasar, when examined more closely, proved to be wearing clothing of obvious quality, but showing no signs of the arthritis or other ailments that would be expected in someone of Princess Meria's advanced age. The captured banners, while genuine, appeared to have been deliberately placed where they would be easily found rather than defended. More disturbing still were the accounts provided by the Dornish refugees. Their stories, while consistent in broad outline, showed suspicious similarities in detail. They all claimed to have fled from camps in the same general region. They all described the same sequence of events following news of Meria's death. They all possessed remarkably detailed knowledge of Targaryen troop movements for people who had supposedly been hiding in the deep desert. Lord Orys, his initial relief giving way to renewed suspicion, began to wonder if they had been deliberately fed information designed to make them believe the war was won. But such doubts seemed paranoid in the face of obvious victory. The raids had stopped. The signals had ceased. Resistance appeared to be crumbling throughout the kingdom. Still, something felt wrong. The victory had come too easily, too completely. In his experience, the death of a charismatic leader usually led to a period of confused resistance as various factions competed for power. Instead, Dornish resistance had simply evaporated overnight, leaving behind only scattered groups that seemed more interested in surrender than continued fighting. As autumn approached and the crushing heat of summer began to moderate, Rhaenys prepared for what seemed likely to be the final phase of the campaign. Intelligence gathered from refugees and prisoners suggested that the remaining Dornish forces were concentrated in the far south, near the ancient seat of House Martell at Sunspear. A coordinated assault combining her dragon with Orys's ground forces should be sufficient to end the war before winter. Yet even as victory seemed assured, strange reports continued to filter in from the edges of Targaryen control. Nomad traders spoke of vast camps hidden in regions that maps marked as uninhabitable wasteland. Prisoners taken during skirmishes showed better knowledge of current events than should have been possible for people cut off from communication networks. Most puzzling of all, the total number of confirmed enemy casualties remained suspiciously low for a kingdom that had supposedly been fighting a desperate war for months. But these were minor concerns compared to the obvious fact that organized resistance had ended. The war for Dorne appeared to be won, its conclusion delayed only by the need to mop up scattered holdouts and restore proper governance to the conquered territory. Princess Meria Martell was dead. The Dornish resistance was broken. The age of Targaryen rule over all 7 kingdoms was finally at hand. Or so it seemed to those who had forgotten that in the desert nothing was ever quite what it appeared to be. The deception began to unravel 3 weeks after the supposed victory at Nardisar, though the first signs were so subtle that even experienced commanders initially dismissed them as coincidence. A supply convoy traveling between Ronwood and the Boneway simply vanished, leaving behind only wheel ruts that led into a maze of canyons before disappearing entirely. The guards' horses returned to their stables riderless but unharmed, their saddlebags filled with desert flowers that bloomed only in the deepest wilderness. Lord Orys stared at these flowers with growing unease, recognizing their significance even as he struggled to accept its implications. These particular blooms, according to his Dornish guides, grew only in regions so remote that even the nomad tribes rarely ventured there. Finding them required intimate knowledge of hidden water sources and secret paths through seemingly impassable terrain. More troubling still, the flowers showed no signs of wilting despite the long journey back to civilization. Queen Rhaenys received this news with skepticism that gradually transformed into cold anger. She had risked herself and her dragon based on intelligence that now appeared deliberately fabricated. The attack on Nardisar, which she had considered a masterpiece of precision warfare, suddenly seemed like an elaborate theatrical performance staged for her benefit. "They played us for fools," she said to Orys as they stood in the map room of Ronwood, studying reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. "The woman we killed was not Princess Meria. The camps we burned were not their real strongholds. Everything we believed about this victory was a lie." The realization forced them to reconsider every aspect of their campaign in Dorne. The mysterious cessation of raids that had seemed to confirm their victory now appeared in a different light. The Dornish had not stopped attacking because their leadership was dead. They had stopped because they were preparing for something far more ambitious than mere harassment of supply lines. New intelligence painted a picture that challenged everything the Targaryens thought they knew about warfare. Deep in the central desert, far beyond the reach of conventional armies, lay a network of installations that defied easy categorization. These were not castles in any traditional sense, but rather complex systems of caves, underground chambers, and carefully concealed surface structures that could house thousands while remaining virtually invisible from the air. The construction of these hidden strongholds represented a feat of engineering that rivaled anything achieved by the great houses of Westeros. Natural cave systems had been expanded and interconnected, creating vast underground cities supplied by hidden aqueducts that tapped into deep aquifers. Surface structures were built to blend seamlessly with the desert landscape, their walls shaped to mimic natural rock formations, while their interiors provided all the amenities of proper castles. Most remarkably, these installations appeared to have been under construction for decades, suggesting a level of long-term planning that spoke to generational commitment to resistance. Princess Meria had not simply improvised a response to Targaryen invasion. She had inherited and expanded upon defensive preparations that dated back to the early years of her reign, possibly even to the time of her father. The scale of this deception became clear as reports accumulated from across the kingdom. The evacuation that had so impressed the Targaryens with its apparent desperation now revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated relocation. The Dornish had not fled in panic. They had simply moved from their secondary positions to their primary ones, from the castles that could be seen and captured to the strongholds that could not even be found. This revelation transformed the entire strategic picture. The Targaryens had not conquered Dorne. They had been allowed to occupy a carefully prepared stage set, taking possession of empty buildings while the real kingdom continued to function beyond their reach. Every castle they held was a liability rather than an asset, requiring garrison forces that could be supplied only through vulnerable lines of communication. Queen Rhaenys found herself facing a completely new form of warfare, one for which neither her training nor her experience had prepared her. Dragon power, the ultimate weapon that had conquered 6 kingdoms, seemed almost irrelevant against an enemy that could simply disappear into the earth. How do you burn what you cannot find? How do you intimidate people who live in places your dragons cannot reach? The answer, when it came, emerged from the most ancient texts in the Targaryen archives. Rhaenys spent long hours in the captured library of Ronwood, reading accounts of the original Valyrian expansion and the wars that had brought dragon lords into conflict with the river-dwelling Rhoynar. These half-forgotten histories spoke of campaigns that had lasted not months but decades, of enemies who had forced the mighty Valyrian freehold to develop entirely new military doctrines. What she discovered in those crumbling scrolls filled her with both fascination and dread. The Rhoynar had been the only people to successfully resist Valyrian conquest for any significant period. Their water magic and intimate knowledge of river systems had allowed them to wage asymmetric warfare against opponents who possessed every conventional advantage. Most importantly, they had developed techniques for fighting dragons that relied not on matching power with power, but on exploiting the specific vulnerabilities of flying creatures and their riders. The texts spoke of dragon traps, carefully prepared ambush sites where archers could strike from concealment at creatures forced to fly through narrow passages. They described weather magic that could create sudden fogs and sandstorms, blinding dragon riders at crucial moments. Most ominously, they referenced weapons specifically designed to penetrate dragon scale, projectiles that could bring down even the largest dragons if properly employed. Princess Meria Rhaenys realized was not simply the ruler of a desert kingdom fighting for independence. She was the heir to 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge about dragon warfare, the keeper of secrets that had been refined through generations of bitter experience. The Rhoynar refugees who had fled to Dorne after the destruction of their cities had brought with them not just their people and their customs, but their military expertise. This understanding cast the entire Dornish resistance in a new light. What had appeared to be desperate improvisation was actually the implementation of strategies that had been planned and prepared over centuries. The hidden strongholds were not panic responses to invasion, but carefully positioned bases for a campaign of resistance that would make the Valyrian wars in Essos seem like minor skirmishes. As autumn deepened, and the first hints of winter began to touch even the southern desert, Rhaenys found herself contemplating a truth that filled her with profound unease. The war for Dorne was not nearing its end. It was only beginning. Everything that had happened so far, from the initial invasion to the false victory at Nysar, had been merely the opening moves in a game of such complexity that she was only now beginning to understand its true scope. The reports that reached her from across the kingdom painted a picture of an enemy that was growing bolder and more sophisticated with each passing day. The raids that had resumed after the brief hiatus were no longer simple harassment of supply lines. They showed evidence of careful intelligence gathering and tactical innovation that suggested professional military planning at the highest levels. More troubling still were the signs that the Dornish resistance enjoyed support from quarters that should have been neutral or even favorable to Targaryen rule. Merchants from the free cities had been observed in areas under Dornish control, suggesting trade relationships that bypassed Targaryen authority entirely. Even more disturbing were reports of sympathizers within the other kingdoms of Westeros, lords who privately questioned the wisdom of Targaryen expansion and might be willing to provide covert assistance to their enemies. The implications were staggering. If the Dornish resistance could sustain itself indefinitely through hidden strongholds and external support, the entire Targaryen project was at risk. Other kingdoms might begin to question their own submission, particularly if Dorne continued to demonstrate that dragons could be defied successfully. The conquest that had seemed complete just months earlier suddenly appeared fragile and incomplete. Yet even these strategic concerns paled beside a more immediate worry that kept Rhaenys awake during the long desert nights. Somewhere in the hidden depths of Dorne, Princess Meria Martell was still alive and still planning. The old woman who had laughed at Aegon's ultimatum was even now preparing moves in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of Westeros itself. The desert wind carried no answers, only the whisper of sand against stone, and the distant cry of hunting hawks circling overhead. But in its endless persistence, in its patient wearing away of even the hardest rock, Rhaenys heard an echo of her enemy's strategy. The Dornish would not break quickly or dramatically. They would grind away at Targaryen strength like wind wearing down a mountain, patient and inexorable and utterly without mercy. Winter was coming to Dorne, bringing with it the season when armies traditionally ceased their campaigning and rulers planned for the battles of the following year. But this was not a traditional war, and Princess Meria had never been a traditional enemy. In the depths of her hidden strongholds, surrounded by advisors who remembered the old ways and warriors who had spent their lives preparing for this moment, the Yellow Toad of Dorne was preparing to teach the dragons the true meaning of fear. Winter in Dorne brought revelations that would forever change the nature of warfare in Westeros. As the desert cooled and the killing heat of summer gave way to bearable temperatures, the true scope of Dornish preparation began to emerge from the shadows. What the Targaryens discovered challenged not only their understanding of military strategy, but their fundamental assumptions about the nature of power itself. The first breakthrough came through an unexpected source. A Dornish prisoner, captured during a failed raid on a supply depot near Blackhaven, proved to be far more than the simple warrior he appeared. Under careful questioning, he revealed himself to be Seriu Garrison Fowler, heir to Skyreach, and one of the most promising young commanders in Dorne. More importantly, he carried with him a leather satchel containing documents that provided unprecedented insight into Dornish operations. The papers, written in a mixture of Common Tongue and High Valyrian, outlined a communication network of staggering sophistication. The mirror signals that had puzzled Targaryen observers were revealed to be merely the most visible component of a system that included everything from trained ravens to human messengers capable of crossing vast distances in remarkably short times. Most impressive of all were detailed maps showing routes through the desert that did not appear on any Targaryen charts, paths that connected hidden strongholds across hundreds of miles of seemingly impassable terrain. Queen Rhaenys studied these captured documents with growing amazement and concern. The level of organization they revealed went far beyond anything she had encountered during the conquest of the other kingdoms. This was not the desperate improvisation of a people fighting for survival, but the careful implementation of plans that had been generations in the making. One document in particular caught her attention, a letter bearing the seal of House Martell that discussed something called the Rhoynar Archive, written in the flowing script of Old Rhoyne. The letter referenced ancient texts that contained detailed analyses of dragon behavior, breeding patterns, and most disturbing of all, anatomical weaknesses. The knowledge preserved in these texts had apparently been gathered during the wars between Valyria and the Rhoynar city-states, compiled by scholars who had dedicated their lives to understanding their enemies. The implications were staggering. For nearly 3 centuries, the Targaryens had believed themselves the sole possessors of dragon lore, the only people who truly understood these magnificent and terrible creatures. The discovery that their ancient enemies had compiled equally detailed knowledge, specifically focused on ways to kill dragons, fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the war. Lord Orys, when shown these documents, experienced something approaching despair. His military career had been built on the assumption that dragons represented an insurmountable advantage in warfare. The sight of detailed diagrams showing dragon anatomy, with specific annotations about vulnerable points where arrows or spears might penetrate, challenged everything he thought he knew about combat. "They have been studying us," he said to Rhaenys, as they pored over the captured papers in the flickering light of oil lamps. "Not just our tactics or our strategies, but our dragons themselves. They know things about Meraxes that we have never considered, weaknesses we have never imagined." The winter months brought further disturbing discoveries as Targaryen forces attempted to expand their control beyond the captured border castles. Scouting expeditions into the deep desert returned with reports of installations that defied conventional military logic. These were not fortresses built to withstand siege, but rather complex systems designed to facilitate mobility and concealment while providing all the resources necessary for sustained resistance. Most impressive were the underground cities that honeycombed the desert floor in seemingly barren regions. These subterranean complexes had been carved from living rock over decades, creating vast chambers that could house thousands of people along with their horses, supplies, and weapons. Natural aquifers had been tapped to provide fresh water, while ingenious ventilation systems ensured breathable air throughout the deepest tunnels. The engineering involved was remarkable enough, but what truly impressed observers was the integration of these hidden strongholds with the surface terrain. Carefully camouflaged entrances allowed large groups to emerge without warning, strike at targets of opportunity, and disappear back underground before any response could be organized. The entire desert had been transformed into a 3-dimensional battlefield where the enemy enjoyed perfect knowledge of the terrain, while their opponents stumbled blind through a landscape full of hidden threats. Yet it was not merely the physical preparations that amazed and alarmed the Targaryens. The cultural transformation of Dorne was equally remarkable and far more threatening to their long-term prospects. An entire generation had grown up expecting war with dragons, trained from childhood in the specialized skills necessary for asymmetric warfare against a technologically superior enemy. Children learned to move silently across sand and stone before they could properly walk. Young women practiced archery from horseback, with the same dedication that noble daughters in other kingdoms devoted to embroidery and music. Boys memorized the flight patterns of different birds, training themselves to recognize the subtle differences between natural wildlife and approaching dragons. Most remarkably, both sexes learned the ancient Rhoynar techniques of weather reading and desert navigation that allowed small groups to survive indefinitely in regions where conventional armies would perish in days. This cultural militarization extended beyond mere technical skills to encompass a fundamental shift in Dornish identity. The people had not simply prepared for war, they had transformed themselves into a weapon specifically designed to destroy dragon riders and their mounts. Every aspect of their society, from child-rearing practices to religious observances, had been modified to support the ultimate goal of preserving Dornish independence against impossible odds. The winter also brought news that placed the Dornish resistance in a broader context that filled Rhaenys with deep foreboding. Merchants arriving from the free cities carried reports of unusual interest in Dornish affairs among the ruling councils of Tyrosh and Lys. These cities had maintained profitable trading relationships with Dorne for centuries, and their leaders viewed Targaryen expansion with considerable suspicion. More troubling were subtle indications that some of the other Westerosi kingdoms were not entirely comfortable with the totality of Targaryen victory. Lords who had bent the knee to Aegon might be reconsidering their submission if Dorne could demonstrate that dragons were not invincible. The prospect of a broader coalition forming against Targaryen rule was one that neither Rhaenys nor her brother husband could afford to ignore. As spring approached and the campaign season prepared to resume, Rhaenys found herself contemplating a war that had already lasted far longer than any of them had anticipated. The swift conquests that had characterized the submission of the other kingdoms now seemed like distant memories from a simpler time when enemies obligingly presented themselves for defeat in conventional battles. The Dornish had transformed warfare itself, creating a new paradigm where superior technology and overwhelming force could be neutralized through patience, preparation, and intimate knowledge of local conditions. They had shown that dragons, magnificent though they were, remained mortal creatures with mortal vulnerabilities. Most dangerously of all, they had demonstrated that the Targaryen model of rule through fear and overwhelming force was not the only path to power. Princess Meria, still hidden somewhere in the vastness of the Dornish desert, had achieved something that no other ruler in Westeros had managed. She had forced the dragons to adapt to her terms rather than accepting theirs. The war for Dorne was no longer about the swift conquest of another kingdom. It had become a test of two fundamentally different approaches to power, with the future of Westeros hanging in the balance. The documents captured from Sarah Garrison Fowler had revealed one final piece of intelligence that haunted Rhaenys through the long desert nights. Buried among the tactical reports and supply inventories was a single sentence that spoke to the true scope of Dornish ambition. It was written in Princess Meria's own hand, recognizable from official correspondence, and it contained just 7 words that changed everything. "When the silver falls, the kingdom remembers." The meaning was clear enough. The Dornish were not simply fighting to preserve their independence. They were fighting to prove that dragons could be killed, that the age of Targaryen invincibility was a myth that could be shattered. When Meraxes fell from the sky, as Princess Meria clearly believed she would, every kingdom in Westeros would remember that the conquerors were not gods but mortals who could be defeated by sufficiently determined enemies. The war for Dorne had become something far more significant than either side had originally imagined. It was no longer merely about the submission of one stubborn kingdom, but about the fundamental nature of power in the new world that Aegon had created. The outcome would determine whether the Targaryen dynasty ruled through genuine strength or merely through the carefully maintained illusion of invincibility. And in the hidden depths of the desert, where ancient Rhoynar weapons were being prepared according to plans that were centuries in the making, Princess Meria continued her patient preparations for the moment when silver would fall from the sky and the world would change forever. The spring of 5 AC brought with it a discovery that would fundamentally alter the course of the Dornish wars and cast new light on centuries of carefully hidden history. Deep beneath the ruins of an abandoned Rhoynar settlement called Croyen Corhor, Targaryen forces stumbled upon a cache of documents that had been sealed away for nearly 400 years. What they found within those ancient vaults would force both sides to confront truths that had been deliberately buried since the fall of the Rhoynar cities. The discovery came about through pure chance, or perhaps through the kind of fate that seems to guide the most momentous events in history. A supply convoy traveling between Ronwood and Skyreach had taken shelter from a sudden sandstorm in what appeared to be natural caves carved into a rocky outcropping. As the storm raged overhead, soldiers exploring the deeper recesses of their temporary refuge found worked stone where none should have existed, walls carved with the flowing script of Old Rhoyne and decorated with images that seemed to tell a story of dragons and water magic locked in eternal conflict. Queen Rhaenys herself led the expedition that returned to explore these caves once the storm had passed. What they discovered defied every expectation and challenged assumptions that had shaped Targaryen understanding of their own history. The caves were not natural formations but rather the outer chambers of a vast underground complex that had been sealed and hidden since the time of Princess Nymeria's arrival in Dorne. Within these chambers lay the most complete archive of Rhoynar knowledge ever discovered in Westeros. Thousands of scrolls and codices had been carefully preserved in the dry desert air, protected by ingenious ventilation systems that had maintained perfect conditions for centuries. But it was not merely the preservation of these texts that amazed the explorers. It was their content which revealed a hidden history of the wars between Valyria and the Rhoynar that painted the conflict in entirely new terms. The documents told a story that no Valyrian text had ever recorded, speaking of Rhoynar victories that had been systematically erased from official histories. They described battles where dragon riders had been brought down by weapons and tactics that the Valyrians had never acknowledged existed. Most remarkably, they contained detailed technical manuals that read like military engineering texts, providing step-by-step instructions for creating weapons specifically designed to kill dragons. Among the most significant discoveries was a series of scrolls written by someone identified only as Garin the Last, apparently one of the final Rhoynar princes to resist Valyrian expansion. These texts provided a first-hand account of the techniques that had allowed the river folk to maintain their resistance for decades against enemies who possessed overwhelming technological advantages. Garin wrote of dragon traps, carefully prepared ambush sites where multiple archers could concentrate fire on flying targets, forced to navigate narrow passages. He described weather magic that could create localized fog banks dense enough to blind dragon riders while leaving ground-based defenders unaffected. Most intriguingly, he detailed the creation of specialized projectiles that could penetrate dragon scale through the application of ancient metallurgical techniques passed down from the early days of Rhoynar civilization. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the scope of knowledge that the Rhoynar had accumulated about their enemies. The archive contained detailed anatomical studies of dragons, compiled over generations of conflict. These texts identified specific vulnerabilities in dragon physiology, weak points where properly placed weapons could cause massive damage. More unsettling still were psychological profiles of dragon riders, analyses of their behavior patterns and decision-making processes that read like intelligence reports from a sophisticated espionage operation. The implication struck Rhaenys with the force of a physical blow. For 3 centuries, the Targaryens had believed themselves the undisputed masters of dragon lore, the only people who truly understood these magnificent creatures. The discovery that their ancient enemies had compiled equally detailed knowledge, specifically focused on ways to exploit dragon weaknesses, fundamentally altered her understanding of the current conflict. These were not merely historical documents. Many of the techniques described in the Rhoynar texts had clear applications to contemporary warfare. The weapon designs could be adapted using modern materials and construction methods. The tactical principles could be applied to the specific geography of Dorne. Most alarmingly, the psychological insights into dragon rider behavior remained as relevant today as they had been 4 centuries ago. As Rhaenys studied scroll after scroll of carefully preserved knowledge, she began to understand why Princess Meria had seemed so confident in her resistance to Targaryen conquest. The old woman was not improvising desperate strategies or hoping for miraculous interventions. She was implementing a systematic campaign based on centuries of accumulated expertise in dragon warfare, techniques that had been tested in actual combat against the greatest dragon riders in history. The archive also revealed the true scope of Rhoynar influence on Dornish culture. What the Targaryens had dismissed as quaint foreign customs were actually the remnants of a sophisticated military tradition that had been carefully preserved and adapted over generations. The Dornish practice of gender equality in inheritance and combat roles reflected Rhoynar military necessity, where every person capable of fighting had been essential to survival. The emphasis on mobility and light cavalry tactics came directly from lessons learned in asymmetric warfare against dragon-mounted opponents. More disturbing still were documents that suggested the existence of similar archives hidden throughout Dorne. References to the 7 repositories implied that the cache at Troyen Cohor was only one of multiple sites where Rhoynar knowledge had been preserved. Each repository apparently specialized in different aspects of anti-dragon warfare, from weapon construction to tactical planning to the cultivation of allies among dragon-riding enemies. The discovery forced a complete re-evaluation of Dornish capabilities and intentions. This was not a desperate last stand by a kingdom fighting for survival. It was the opening phase of a carefully planned campaign that drew upon 4 centuries of military experience and accumulated knowledge. Princess Meria possessed resources and expertise that the Targaryens had never imagined, weapons both physical and psychological that had been specifically designed to neutralize their greatest advantages. Lord Orys, when shown the most significant documents from the archive, experienced something approaching existential dread. His entire military career had been built upon the assumption of Targaryen invincibility, the belief that dragons represented an insurmountable advantage in warfare. The sight of detailed tactical manuals describing successful operations against dragon riders challenged not only his strategic assumptions but his fundamental understanding of the world. "They know us better than we know ourselves," he said to Rhaenys, as they examined a particularly detailed analysis of dragon flight patterns and rider decision-making processes. "These texts describe weaknesses in our tactics that we have never recognized, vulnerabilities that we have never even considered." The psychological impact of these revelations extended far beyond their immediate military implications. The Targaryens had built their conquest of Westeros on a foundation of perceived invincibility, the carefully maintained belief that dragons made them something more than merely human rulers with superior weapons. The discovery that ancient enemies had developed systematic methods for defeating dragons threatened to undermine the entire psychological basis of Targaryen rule. If word of these archives spread beyond the immediate circle of military commanders, it could have devastating consequences for Targaryen authority throughout the 7 kingdoms. Lords who had bent the knee out of fear rather than loyalty might begin to reconsider their positions if they learned that dragons could be systematically hunted and killed. The careful balance of power that Aegon had established through conquest might collapse if his enemies discovered that his advantages were not as overwhelming as they appeared. Yet perhaps the most troubling revelation was the evidence of ongoing communication between Dorne and surviving Rhoynar communities in Essos. Several documents referenced recent correspondence with the Eastern Brothers, apparently descendants of Rhoynar refugees who had fled to the Free Cities rather than following Princess Meria to Westeros. These communities had apparently maintained their own military traditions and technological development, creating a network of anti-Valyrian expertise that spanned 2 continents. The implications were staggering. The war for Dorne was not an isolated conflict between a single kingdom and its would-be conquerors. It was part of a broader struggle that connected to ancient grievances and ongoing resistance movements throughout the known world. Princess Meria enjoyed not only the accumulated wisdom of centuries, but also the active support of allies who had spent generations preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. As spring turned towards summer and the campaign season approached, Rhaenys found herself contemplating a conflict that had already exceeded every parameter she had used to understand warfare. The enemy she faced was not merely Princess Meria and her desert lords, but the heir to a military tradition that had been specifically designed to destroy everything the Targaryens represented. The archive at Troyen Cohor had revealed one final piece of intelligence that haunted her thoughts as she planned the coming season's operations. Hidden among the technical manuals and tactical analyses was a prophetic text, apparently written by one of the last Rhoynar seers before the fall of their civilization. The prophecy spoke of a time when silver would fall from summer skies, when the water's children would teach fire the meaning of mortality. It described a great battle in a place where stone bleeds and sand remembers, where ancient knowledge would finally claim its revenge against the destroyers of the Rhoynar cities. The text was frustratingly vague in its details, written in the symbolic language favored by ancient seers and prophecy makers, but its general meaning was clear enough to chill even the bravest dragon rider. Somewhere in the wastes of Dorne, Princess Meria was preparing to fulfill a destiny that had been foretold 4 centuries before her birth, using weapons and knowledge that had been preserved through generations of exile and planning. The war for Dorne had become something far greater than a simple conquest. It was the climactic confrontation between 2 ancient civilizations, the final settling of accounts that had been accumulating interest for 400 years, and in the depths of her hidden strongholds, surrounded by advisors who carried the accumulated wisdom of a destroyed people, the Yellow Toad of Dorne was preparing to teach dragons the true meaning of fear. The summer of 5 AC brought with it a cascade of revelations that would forever change how the Targaryens understood not only their enemies in Dorne, but the very nature of their rule over Westeros. As Queen Rhaenys delved deeper into the secrets uncovered at Rhoynar, a pattern began to emerge that connected the Dornish resistance to a vast network of hidden alliances and ancient grudges spanning the known world. The first threads of this larger tapestry were discovered in correspondence found within the Rhoynar archive, letters written in a code that had taken Maester Qyburn weeks to decipher. These communications revealed ongoing contact between Princess Meria and various factions throughout Essos, including merchant princes of the free cities who had maintained ancestral memories of Valyrian oppression. More disturbing still were references to sympathizers within Westeros itself, lords and maesters, who privately questioned the wisdom of Targaryen expansion and were prepared to offer covert assistance to their enemies. The scope of this conspiracy became clear when Rhaenys realized that the Dornish resistance enjoyed support from quarters that should have been neutral or even favorable to Targaryen interests. The Iron Bank of Braavos, founded by refugees from Valyrian expansion, had apparently been providing financial backing to Dornish operations for years. Merchant fleets from Pentos and Tyros had been smuggling weapons and supplies into hidden ports along the Dornish coast, using trade routes that had been established specifically to bypass Targaryen oversight. Most shocking of all were the indications that elements within the Faith of the Seven were actively working against Targaryen interests. Several intercepted letters referenced the warriors' true servants and spoke of a religious obligation to resist those who would make slaves of free men through the terror of false dragons. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the Targaryens faced not merely military opposition, but ideological resistance rooted in fundamental questions about the nature of legitimate rule. This religious dimension to the conflict added layers of complexity that neither Rhaenys nor her advisors had anticipated. The Faith of the Seven had generally accepted Targaryen rule, recognizing Aegon as a legitimate king and blessing his conquest as divinely ordained. The discovery that some elements within the faith viewed dragons as abominations and their riders as usurpers challenged the entire theological foundation of Targaryen authority. The conspiracy extended even deeper than religious opposition. Careful analysis of the captured documents revealed evidence of a coordinated intelligence network that had been operating throughout Westeros since before Aegon's conquest. This network included not only obvious opponents like dispossessed royalty and ambitious lords, but also supposedly loyal servants who had been feeding information to Dornish agents for years. Ravens flying to King's Landing had been intercepted and their messages copied before being allowed to continue their journey. Servants in the Red Keep itself had apparently been reporting on royal conversations and strategic planning sessions. Most alarmingly, some of the maesters serving Targaryen allies had been secretly members of a faction within the Citadel that opposed dragon rule on philosophical grounds. The revelation that struck Rhaenys with the greatest force concerned the true nature of Princess Meria's longevity and apparent vitality despite her advanced age. Documents found in the deepest chambers of the archive suggested that the princess possessed access to knowledge that went far beyond conventional medicine or healing arts. References to the water's gift and renewal through the Mother Rhoyna's blessing implied that Rhoynar traditions included practices that could extend human lifespan far beyond normal parameters. This was not merely a matter of good health and careful living. The text described specific rituals and treatments that could restore youth and vigor to aged bodies, techniques that had apparently been preserved and practiced by Rhoynar descendants throughout their exile. Princess Meria was not simply a remarkable octogenarian ruler, but someone who had artificially extended her life and capabilities through the application of ancient knowledge. The implications terrified Rhaenys on multiple levels. If Meria possessed access to life extension techniques, she represented a completely different category of opponent than any the Targaryens had previously faced. This was not an elderly ruler whose death would naturally resolve the conflict, but someone who might continue to oppose them for decades or even centuries to come. Moreover, the existence of such knowledge suggested that the Rhoynar refugees had preserved far more of their ancient civilization than anyone had realized. If they possessed techniques for extending human life, what other capabilities might they have maintained? The water magic that had made them formidable opponents to ancient Valyria might not be merely historical legend, but ongoing practice among their descendants. As summer progressed and intelligence continued to accumulate, the true scope of what the Targaryens faced became increasingly clear. This was not a regional conflict about the independence of a single kingdom, but rather the opening phase of a civilizational struggle that had been building for centuries. The Dornish resistance represented the culmination of generational planning by survivors of Valyrian expansion, their final attempt to settle accounts that dated back to the destruction of their homeland. The conspiracy extended throughout the known world, connecting surviving Rhoynar communities in Essos with their cousins in Dorne and reaching into the very heart of Targaryen power in Westeros. Financial support from Bravos, weapons from the free cities, intelligence from sympathizers within the Seven Kingdoms, and ancient knowledge preserved in hidden archives combined to create a network of resistance that dwarfed anything the Targaryens had previously encountered. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the indications that this conspiracy enjoyed support from unexpected quarters within Westeros itself. Lords who had bent the knee to Aegon were apparently having second thoughts about the wisdom of Targaryen rule. The faith of the Seven was fracturing along ideological lines, with significant factions questioning whether dragon riders represented legitimate authority or demonic usurpation. Even within the Targaryen household itself, there were signs of doubt and division. Servants who had seemed completely loyal were revealed to have divided allegiances. Maesters who had served the family faithfully were discovered to harbor philosophical objections to dragon rule. Most troubling of all, some members of the royal family itself were beginning to question whether their conquest had been as beneficial as they had originally believed. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating for those who had built their identities around Targaryen invincibility. Rhaenys found herself questioning not only her strategic assumptions, but her fundamental understanding of her family's place in the world. The dragons that had seemed like natural instruments of divine will now appeared as tools of oppression that had created more enemies than subjects. Lord Orys, whose military career had been built upon the foundation of Targaryen superiority, experienced something approaching a crisis of faith. The discovery that their enemies possessed detailed knowledge of dragon weaknesses and centuries of experience in anti-dragon warfare forced him to confront the possibility that everything he believed about military strategy had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. The correspondence found in the archive painted a picture of Princess Meria as something far more significant than a regional ruler defending her territory. She was revealed as the focal point of a movement that spanned continents and generations, the heir to accumulated grievances and preserved knowledge that had been carefully maintained through centuries of exile and planning. Her resistance to Targaryen conquest was not simply about Dornish independence, but about the settling of ancient accounts and the vindication of a destroyed civilization. The Rhoynar had not forgotten their defeat at Valyrian hands, and through their descendants in Dorne, they had finally found an opportunity to claim their revenge. The letters spoke of Princess Meria not merely as a political leader but as something approaching a religious figure, the chosen instrument through which ancient prophecies would be fulfilled and historical injustices finally addressed. Her followers saw the war against the Targaryens not as a simple military conflict but as a cosmic struggle between competing visions of how the world should be ordered. As autumn approached and the campaign season drew toward its close, Rhaenys found herself contemplating a war that had completely exceeded every parameter she had used to understand conflict. The enemy she faced was not merely a stubborn kingdom refusing to submit, but the embodiment of 4 centuries of accumulated hatred and carefully preserved knowledge. The true scope of what lay ahead became clear in a final document found in the deepest chambers of the archive, a letter written in Princess Meria's own hand and addressed to the Eastern brothers in the Free Cities. The letter spoke of approaching culmination, of ancient promises soon to be fulfilled, of a moment when the children of water would finally teach the children of fire the true meaning of mortality. Most ominously, the letter referenced specific preparations for the silver falling, apparently a coded reference to the destruction of Meraxes and her rider. The document contained detailed intelligence about Rhaenys' flight patterns, her preferred routes and timing, her dragon's behavioral tendencies, all suggesting that Princess Meria was not simply hoping for a favorable opportunity, but actively creating the conditions for a specific ambush. The war for Dorne had become something far greater than either side had originally imagined. It was no longer merely about the conquest of one stubborn kingdom, but about the fundamental nature of power and legitimacy in a world where ancient grievances could simmer for centuries before finally demanding satisfaction. And in the hidden depths of the desert, where weapons forged from Rhoynar knowledge waited to taste dragon blood, Princess Meria was preparing to write the final chapter in a story that had begun 400 years before her birth. The autumn of 6 AC marked a turning point in the Dornish wars, though not in the way that either side had originally anticipated. As the brutal summer heat gave way to cooler temperatures that made large-scale military operations possible, both the Targaryens and their enemies began preparations for what promised to be the decisive phase of their long conflict. What emerged from this period of intensive planning would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare in Westeros and challenge assumptions about power that had governed the known world for centuries. Princess Meria Martell, now nearing her 82nd year, had summoned the greatest gathering of military minds in Dornish history to her hidden stronghold deep beneath the Scourge, that vast desert wasteland that even the nomad tribes considered uninhabitable. The location itself was a testament to the sophistication of Rhoynar engineering, a vast underground complex that had been carved from living rock over decades of secret construction. The Great Hall of the Scourge, as it came to be known, could accommodate thousands while remaining completely invisible from the surface. Natural light filtered down through ingeniously designed shafts that appeared to outside observers as nothing more than unusual rock formations. Underground rivers provided fresh water and powered mills that ground grain and forged weapons. Most remarkably, the entire complex was connected to similar installations throughout Dorne by a network of tunnels that allowed rapid movement of people and supplies across vast distances. Within this hidden capital, representatives from across the known world gathered to share their accumulated knowledge of dragon warfare. From the Free Cities came descendants of Rhoynar refugees who had maintained their military traditions throughout centuries of exile. Bravo Sea merchants brought not only gold but detailed intelligence gathered by the Iron Bank's extensive spy network. Even more exotic were the delegates from distant Slavers Bay, survivors of ancient conflicts with Valyrian expansion, who possessed their own hard-won expertise in anti-dragon tactics. The knowledge that these diverse groups brought together was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The Pentoshi delegation presented weapons that had been specifically designed for use against dragons, including specialized ballistae that fired bolts capable of penetrating dragon scale at remarkable distances. Their crossbow mechanisms incorporated metallurgical techniques that had been developed through generations of experimentation, creating projectiles that could maintain their penetrating power even when fired at extreme range. From Tyrosh came intelligence about dragon behavior that had been gathered through careful observation of Targaryen military operations throughout their conquest of Westeros. These reports included detailed analyses of flight patterns, reaction times, and the decision-making processes of individual dragon riders. Most valuable of all were psychological profiles of Queen Rhaenys herself, compiled through years of careful study by merchants and diplomats who had observed her in both formal and informal settings. The delegates from Norvos brought perhaps the most disturbing intelligence of all, evidence that the Targaryens were not universally beloved even within their own conquered territories. Secret correspondence with sympathizers throughout the Seven Kingdoms revealed widespread discontent with dragon rule, carefully hidden beneath the surface of apparent submission. Lords who had bent the knee out of fear rather than conviction were privately reconsidering their loyalty, particularly as reports of successful Dornish resistance spread throughout Westeros. But it was the knowledge preserved by the Rhoynar descendants themselves that proved most crucial to the developing strategy. Elder Nymeria Coheres, great-granddaughter of one of Princess Nymeria's original companions, had spent her entire life studying the ancient texts that detailed the river folk's wars against Valyria. Her presentation to the assembled council revealed techniques and weapons that had been tested in actual combat against the greatest dragon riders in history. The Rhoynar had learned through bitter experience that dragons possessed specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sufficiently determined enemies. Their anatomical studies, compiled through centuries of conflict, identified weak points in dragon armor where properly placed projectiles could cause catastrophic damage. More importantly, they had developed psychological tactics that could exploit the close bond between dragons and their riders, using the emotional connection as a weapon against both parties. Elder Coheres spoke of weather magic that could create localized atmospheric disturbances, sudden fog banks and wind shears that could disorient flying creatures and force them into vulnerable positions. She described acoustic weapons that produced sounds capable of causing dragons physical pain, frequencies that could drive the great beasts into panic or rage. Most remarkably, she revealed the existence of chemical compounds that could temporarily blind or incapacitate dragons without causing permanent harm, allowing attackers to approach close enough to employ more conventional weapons. The gathering was not merely about sharing existing knowledge, but about adapting ancient techniques to contemporary conditions. The geography of Dorne differed significantly from the river systems where the Rhoynar had originally developed their anti-dragon tactics. Desert warfare required different approaches, exploiting the unique characteristics of sand and stone rather than water and marsh. Weaponsmiths from across the known world collaborated on designs that incorporated the best elements of various traditions. Cohoric steel was combined with Rhoynar engineering principles to create projectiles of unprecedented effectiveness. Myrish crossbow mechanisms were modified according to specifications found in ancient texts, producing weapons that could achieve both accuracy and penetrating power at ranges that had previously been considered impossible. The logistical challenges of preparing for dragon warfare were as complex as the technical ones. Unlike conventional battles, which could be planned according to predictable patterns of movement and engagement, fighting dragons required the ability to respond instantly to rapidly changing conditions. The Dornish forces needed to be positioned where they could strike effectively while remaining concealed from aerial observation, a problem that required innovative solutions to ancient challenges. The answer came from careful study of Dornish geography, combined with intelligence about Targaryen flight patterns. Certain regions of the kingdom offered natural advantages for anti-dragon operations, locations where terrain features could be used to channel flying creatures into predetermined killing zones. The most promising of these was a narrow canyon near the ancient seat of House Ula, where rocky walls would force any approaching dragon to fly in a predictable pattern while providing concealment for defending forces. This location, known as Hellholt's Throat, became the focus of intensive preparation throughout the autumn months. Engineers worked to modify the natural terrain, creating concealed positions for archers and ballistae, while ensuring that retreat routes remained open if the initial assault failed. Supply caches were established throughout the region, allowing defending forces to sustain themselves indefinitely, even if cut off from conventional supply lines. The psychological preparation proved as important as the physical arrangements. Fighting dragons required a particular type of courage, the ability to stand firm in the face of creatures that inspired terror in even the bravest warriors. Elder Coheri's shared techniques developed by her ancestors for overcoming the paralyzing fear that dragons induced mental disciplines that allowed fighters to maintain focus and accuracy even when confronted with the ultimate predators. Religious elements played a crucial role in this psychological preparation. The old gods of the forest, the drowned god of the Iron Islands, and even aspects of the Faith of the Seven were invoked to provide spiritual strength for the coming battle. Most important of all were the rituals inherited from the Mother Rhoynar herself, ceremonies that connected the fighters to the ancient spirits of water and growing things that had opposed the fire of Valyria since the dawn of civilization. As winter approached and the decisive confrontation drew near, Princess Meria found herself at the center of a military machine, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Representatives from a dozen different cultures had contributed their expertise to the creation of weapons and tactics specifically designed to bring down dragons. Intelligence networks spanning 2 continents had provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions. Most importantly, the accumulated wisdom of centuries had been focused on a single objective, the moment when silver would fall from the sky and the age of Targaryen invincibility would end forever. The gathering at the Scourge had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of warfare. It had created a synthesis of knowledge and technique that transcended individual cultures and traditions, forging a new understanding of how to wage war against enemies who possessed seemingly insurmountable advantages. The Dornish forces that would soon face Queen Rhaenys and her dragon represented not merely the resistance of a single kingdom, but the culmination of 4 centuries of accumulated expertise in dragon warfare. Yet even as preparations reached their final stages, Princess Meria remained acutely aware of the risks they faced. Dragons had conquered 6 kingdoms and destroyed the greatest civilization of the ancient world. The weapons and techniques being prepared in the hidden chambers beneath the Scourge had been tested before, but never against creatures as magnificent and terrible as the Targaryen dragons. The knowledge had been gathered. The weapons had been forged. The fighters had been trained and positioned. Now all that remained was to wait for Queen Rhaenys to fly into the trap that 4 centuries of planning had prepared for her. In the depths of Hellholt's Throat, where ancient Rhoynar wisdom would finally meet Targaryen pride, the fate of Westeros itself would be decided in a confrontation that would echo through history for generations to come. The winter of 6 AC brought an unnatural stillness to Dorne, a quiet that spoke not of peace but of forces gathering like storm clouds before the deluge. In the captured castles where Targaryen banners flew, sentries reported strange phenomena that defied rational explanation. Desert winds carried sounds that might have been distant war horns, or might have been tricks of heated air moving through canyon walls. Mirages seemed more vivid and persistent than usual, showing glimpses of armies that vanished when approached directly. Queen Rhaenys felt the weight of destiny pressing upon her shoulders as she prepared for what both sides understood would be the decisive confrontation of their long war. Intelligence gathered throughout the autumn had painted an increasingly clear picture of Dornish preparations, revealing the existence of weapons and tactics that challenged everything the Targaryens believed about their own invincibility. Yet despite this knowledge, or perhaps because of it, Rhaenys found herself driven by a compulsion that went beyond mere military necessity. The discovery of the Rhoynar archives had transformed her understanding of the conflict, revealing it to be not merely a struggle for territorial control, but a cosmic confrontation between competing visions of power and legitimacy. The knowledge that ancient enemies had spent centuries preparing for this exact moment filled her with a mixture of dread and fascination that kept her awake through the long desert nights. Meraxes, her magnificent silver dragon, seemed to sense her rider's inner turmoil. The great beast had grown increasingly restless as winter progressed, roaring challenges to empty skies and breathing flame at shadows that only she could see. Dragons, according to Targaryen lore, possessed senses that extended beyond the merely physical, and Meraxes appeared to perceive threats that remained invisible to human observation. The relationship between dragon and rider had always been the foundation of Targaryen power, a bond that transcended mere training or dominance to become something approaching telepathic communion. Yet now that very connection had become a source of vulnerability, as intelligence from the Rhoynar archives revealed how ancient enemies had learned to exploit the emotional link between mount and rider for their own purposes. Lord Orys had spent the winter months attempting to develop countermeasures against the techniques described in the captured documents, but the results were discouragingly limited. Dragons were creatures of pride and instinct, bred for aggression and dominance, and attempts to modify their behavior patterns met with varying degrees of success. More troubling still was the realization that many of the Rhoynar techniques were designed not to directly harm the dragons, but to manipulate their natural behaviors in ways that would create opportunities for more conventional attacks. The psychological pressure was perhaps most intense for those who understood the true scope of what they faced. Maester Qyburn, who had spent months studying the captured Rhoynar texts, had developed a haunted look that spoke to the depths of knowledge he had uncovered. The ancient documents revealed not merely military techniques but philosophical arguments about the nature of dragons and their riders that challenged fundamental assumptions about Targaryen legitimacy. According to Rhoynar scholars, dragons were not merely powerful animals, but creatures whose very existence represented a disruption of natural order. Their texts spoke of dragons as embodiments of unchecked ambition and destructive pride, beings whose presence corrupted the lands they inhabited, and whose riders inevitably became tyrants, regardless of their original intentions. These were not merely the propaganda of defeated enemies, but sophisticated analyses backed by centuries of careful observation. The implications were particularly troubling for Rhaenys, who had always seen herself as a force for civilization and order rather than destruction. The Rhoynar texts forced her to confront the possibility that her very nature as a dragon rider made her an agent of chaos and oppression, regardless of her personal intentions or moral convictions. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon her spirit like a physical burden, making even routine decisions seem fraught with cosmic significance. As spring approached and the campaign season prepared to resume, intelligence reports began arriving that painted an increasingly clear picture of Dornish preparations. The enemy had consolidated their forces in the region around Hellholt, the ancient seat of House Ulla that had been abandoned during the initial Targaryen invasion. The choice of location was clearly deliberate, as the surrounding terrain offered numerous advantages for forces attempting to ambush flying opponents. More disturbing were reports of unusual activity throughout the region, including the movement of large quantities of specialized equipment and the gathering of individuals whose skills suggested preparations for a very specific type of warfare. Weaponsmiths, engineers, and what appeared to be scholars or priests had been observed converging on the area, bringing with them materials and knowledge that could only be intended for use against dragons. The Dornish had also been conducting what could only be described as rehearsals, elaborate exercises that simulated dragon attacks while testing the coordination and timing required for their defensive measures. These preparations showed a level of sophistication that spoke to years of planning and practice, suggesting that the coming confrontation would be unlike anything the Targaryens had previously experienced. Yet despite the obvious dangers, Rhaenys found herself drawn to the approaching battle with an intensity that surprised even her closest advisors. The discovery of the Rhoynar archives had revealed the existence of an intellectual and spiritual challenge that went far beyond mere military conflict. These ancient enemies had developed not only the weapons to kill dragons, but the philosophical framework to justify such actions, and confronting that challenge had become a personal necessity. The weight of expectation was enormous. Success would validate not merely Targaryen military superiority, but the entire foundation of their rule over Westeros. The other kingdoms would see that even the most sophisticated resistance could be overcome through dragon power, ensuring continued submission for generations to come. Failure, however, would have consequences that extended far beyond the loss of a single kingdom, potentially triggering rebellions throughout the Seven Kingdoms as lords reconsidered their relationship with dragon-riding overlords. King Aegon himself had sent increasingly urgent messages from King's Landing, expressing his concern about the duration and cost of the Dornish campaign. The other kingdoms were beginning to question the wisdom of prolonged warfare against enemies who seemed capable of indefinite resistance, and some lords were privately suggesting that Dorne might be allowed to maintain its independence in exchange for formal recognition of Targaryen authority elsewhere. Such suggestions filled Rhaenys with cold fury, representing as they did a fundamental betrayal of everything the conquest had been meant to achieve. The Targaryens had not spent years bringing the Seven Kingdoms under their rule only to accept the continued existence of independent territories within their borders. The precedent of successful resistance would inevitably encourage others to attempt similar defiance, potentially unraveling the entire political structure that Aegon had created. The personal stakes were equally high. Rhaenys had built her identity around her role as a conqueror and dragon rider, seeing herself as the instrument through which Targaryen destiny would be fulfilled. The possibility that she might fail where her brother-husband had succeeded created an inner tension that manifested in sleepless nights and periods of brooding silence that worried her closest companions. Meraxes reflected her rider's emotional state, the great dragon becoming increasingly aggressive and unpredictable as the decisive moment approached. The beast seemed to sense that something fundamental was at stake, that the coming battle would determine not merely tactical success or failure, but the essential nature of what dragons and their riders represented in the world. As the final preparations continued, strange reports began filtering in from across Dorne and even beyond its borders. Merchants traveling the trade routes spoke of unusual weather patterns, sudden fogs that appeared without warning, and winds that seemed to blow from impossible directions. Religious figures in the free cities reported dreams and visions that spoke of great changes approaching, cosmic shifts that would reshape the balance of power throughout the known world. Even more disturbing were reports from within the Seven Kingdoms themselves, where the prolonged war in Dorne was beginning to have unexpected consequences. Lords who had accepted Targaryen rule were beginning to question whether dragons truly represented invincible power, particularly as stories of successful Dornish resistance spread throughout the realm. The faith of the Seven was experiencing internal tensions as different factions debated the theological implications of dragon rule and the legitimacy of resistance to it. The approaching confrontation had thus become something far more significant than a simple military engagement. It represented a test of fundamental principles about power, legitimacy, and the nature of civilization itself. The outcome would determine not merely whether Dorne would submit to Targaryen rule, but whether the entire system of dragon-based authority could survive the challenges that were emerging throughout the known world. As spring turned towards summer and the date of the final assault approached, Rhaenys found herself experiencing a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. She understood that she was about to enter a battle that would define not only her own legacy, but the future of her entire dynasty. The ancient enemies who waited for her in the wastes of Dorne possessed knowledge and weapons that had been 4 centuries in the making, tools specifically designed to bring down dragons and their riders. Yet she also felt the weight of destiny pressing upon her, the sense that everything in her life had been leading to this moment. The blood of old Valyria flowed in her veins, carrying with it the accumulated pride and power of the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The challenge represented by Princess Meria and her desert warriors was thus not merely military, but existential, a test of whether the Dragon Lord's legacy would endure or whether it would finally be brought to an end by enemies who had never forgotten their ancient grievances. The truth that awaited her in the burning sands of Dorne would answer questions that had been building for centuries, determining whether dragons truly were the ultimate weapons their riders believed them to be, or whether they were merely magnificent creatures whose weaknesses had finally been discovered by sufficiently determined enemies. The morning of the great battle dawned clear and merciless over the wasteland surrounding Hellholt, the ancient seat of House Ula that had stood empty since the early days of the Targaryen invasion. Queen Rhaenys rose before the sun, as was her custom before important engagements, and made her way to where Meraxes waited in the rocky outcropping that served as her temporary eyrie. The great silver dragon seemed unusually restless, her massive head turning constantly toward the south, as if sensing something beyond the range of human perception. The intelligence reports had been consistent for weeks. Princess Meria Martell had finally emerged from her hidden strongholds, establishing what appeared to be a conventional military camp in the ruins of Hellholt itself. For the first time since the war began, the Dornish leadership had presented themselves as a target that Dragonfire could reach, abandoning the guerrilla tactics that had frustrated Targaryen forces for nearly 3 years. To Lord Orys and the other commanders, this apparent change in strategy suggested either desperation or a trap. The Dornish had proven far too sophisticated in their planning to suddenly abandon the advantages that had served them so well. Yet the opportunity was too significant to ignore. If Princess Meria could be eliminated along with her senior commanders, the resistance would collapse regardless of how many weapons or supplies remained hidden throughout the kingdom. Rhaenys had spent the previous evening in conference with her advisors, studying maps and intelligence reports that detailed the layout of the ruined castle and its surroundings. Hellholt had originally been built into a natural canyon formation, its walls rising from living rock in a design that provided excellent defense against conventional assault, but left it vulnerable to attack from above. The positioning seemed almost deliberately chosen to favor dragon tactics. As the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, Rhaenys made her final preparations for what everyone understood would be the decisive engagement of the war. She donned her riding leathers, reinforced with mail and plate in the vital areas, and checked the straps and buckles that would secure her to Meraxes during the violent maneuvers of aerial combat. Her weapons were simple but effective, a Valyrian steel sword and a crossbow designed specifically for use from Dragonback. The flight south from Yaranwood took less than 2 hours, with Meraxes maintaining a steady pace that would bring them to their target at the optimal time for a devastating assault. Below them, the desert landscape unfolded in its familiar patterns of red sand and weathered stone, broken by the occasional oasis or abandoned settlement. Everything appeared normal, yet Rhaenys found herself troubled by a sense of wrongness that she could not precisely define. As they approached the coordinates where Hellholt should have been visible, the first signs of the trap became apparent. What had appeared in intelligence reports as a simple canyon formation revealed itself to be a complex maze of interconnected ravines and hidden chambers. The ruins of the castle seemed smaller and more scattered than they should have been, as if the original structure had been deliberately modified to create a very different tactical environment. More troubling still was the complete absence of visible activity around the supposed Dornish encampment. No smoke rose from cooking fires, no banners flew from improvised flagpoles, no sentries could be seen manning defensive positions. The entire area had the empty quality of a stage set waiting for actors to take their places, beautiful and detailed but fundamentally artificial. Rhaenys felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm as Meraxes circled the target area at maximum altitude, searching for signs of the enemy forces that intelligence had reported. The great dragon's behavior had become increasingly agitated, her head weaving from side to side as she tested the air for scents that might reveal hidden threats. Dragons possessed senses far more acute than those of humans, and Meraxes clearly perceived dangers that remained invisible to her rider. The attack, when it came, erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, with a coordination that spoke to months of careful rehearsal. The first flight of projectiles rose from concealed positions throughout the canyon walls, massive bolts fired from ballistae that had been specifically designed for anti-dragon warfare. These were not the crude weapons that might have been improvised by desperate defenders, but sophisticated siege engines that incorporated metallurgy and engineering techniques preserved from the ancient wars between Valyria and the Rhoynar. Meraxes twisted in the air with the fluid grace of a creature born to flight, avoiding the first volley through sheer aerial superiority and combat instinct. Yet even as she evaded these initial attacks, more projectiles rose from positions that had been invisible moments before. The entire canyon system had been transformed into a three-dimensional killing field, with overlapping fields of fire that made evasion increasingly difficult. The ballista bolts themselves were unlike anything the Targaryens had encountered before. Rather than simple iron points, they carried heads forged from metal that seemed to burn with its own inner fire, glowing red-hot despite the absence of any visible heating source. When these projectiles struck stone, they burrowed into the rock like living things, creating explosions of sparks and superheated fragments that filled the air with deadly shrapnel. But the true horror of the trap revealed itself only when Meraxes attempted to climb above the effective range of the ground-based weapons. As the great dragon rose toward the canyon rim, the air itself seemed to thicken and resist her passage. What had appeared to be clear desert sky was revealed to be something else entirely, a barrier of supernatural force that pressed down upon the ascending dragon like an invisible weight. The magic was subtle but unmistakable, a working of power that drew upon knowledge preserved from the ancient conflicts between water and fire. The Rhoynar had learned to manipulate air currents and atmospheric pressure, creating zones where flying creatures found their movements constrained and their natural advantages neutralized. Meraxes found herself trapped within a space that seemed to grow smaller with each passing moment, forced to remain at altitudes where the hidden weapons could reach her. Rhaenys felt her dragon's growing panic through their telepathic bond, a fear that was all the more terrifying because it came from a creature that had never known defeat. Meraxes had faced armies and castles, had burned cities and scattered fleets, but she had never encountered enemies who possessed the knowledge and weapons necessary to challenge her in her own element. The great dragon's confusion and terror transmitted themselves to her rider, creating a feedback of emotion that made rational thought increasingly difficult. The second phase of the assault began just as Meraxes managed to break free from the atmospheric constraint that had held her trapped within the canyon. As the dragon climbed desperately toward open sky, new enemies revealed themselves on the canyon rim, archers whose positions had been concealed by techniques that seemed to bend light itself around their hiding places. Their bows were unlike any conventional weapons, crafted from materials that gleamed with the same inner fire as the ballista bolts. The arrows that rose to meet Meraxes carried more than mere physical force. Each projectile trailed streams of silver fire that seemed to burn without consuming, creating patterns in the air that hurt to look upon directly. When these supernatural arrows struck dragon scale, they burrowed inward like parasites, their alien fire spreading along the dragon's hide in networks of blazing agony. Meraxes screamed, a sound unlike anything that had ever emerged from her throat before. The great dragon's cry carried not merely pain but genuine terror, the voice of a creature encountering forces that challenged her fundamental nature. Her wings beat frantically as she sought to escape the canyon's confines, but the supernatural arrows continued to find their mark, each strike adding to the spreading network of silver fire that crawled across her magnificent hide. The third and most devastating phase of the ambush revealed itself only when Meraxes finally cleared the canyon rim and seemed poised to escape into open desert. Hidden beneath the sand at carefully calculated intervals lay devices that erupted upward at the precise moment of the dragon's passage, launching nets woven from metal that gleamed with the same supernatural properties as the arrows and ballista bolts. These nets were not intended to entangle Meraxes physically, for no conventional material could have restrained a creature of her size and strength. Instead, they carried enchantments that disrupted the mystical forces that allowed dragons to fly, interfering with the supernatural elements that made creatures of such massive size capable of aerial maneuver. As the magical nets settled over Meraxes, her flight became labored and erratic, her great wings struggling against forces that seemed to drain the very power from her movements. The final moments of the battle unfolded with the terrible inevitability of ancient prophecy finally coming to pass. Meraxes, wounded and disoriented by weapons specifically designed to exploit her vulnerabilities, lost altitude rapidly as the magical constraints overwhelmed her ability to remain airborne. The great silver dragon crashed into the sand with an impact that could be felt for miles around, her massive body creating a crater that would remain visible for generations to come. Queen Rhaenys, thrown clear by the force of the impact, found herself lying broken in the burning sand as figures emerged from concealment throughout the battlefield. These were not the wild desert warriors she had expected, but soldiers whose equipment and discipline spoke to professional military training of the highest order. Their weapons gleamed with the same supernatural fire that had brought down her dragon, and their movements showed the coordination of troops who had rehearsed this exact scenario countless times. As consciousness faded, and the desert sun blazed down upon the first Targaryen to fall in battle, Rhaenys understood at last the true scope of what her family had faced in Dorne. This was not merely the resistance of a single kingdom, but the culmination of 4 centuries of careful planning by enemies who had never forgotten their ancient grievances. The weapons that had killed Meraxes were not crude improvisation but sophisticated applications of knowledge that had been preserved and refined through generations of exile and planning. The silver dragon lay still in the desert sand, her magnificent hide already beginning to fade from its supernatural glow to the dull gray of ordinary metal. Around her broken form, Princess Meria's warriors gathered in respectful silence, understanding that they had witnessed the end of an age. For the first time since the conquest began, a dragon had fallen in battle, proving to the world that even the mightiest weapons of the Targaryen dynasty could be brought low by sufficiently determined enemies. The war for Dorne had claimed its first dragon, and with Meraxes' death, the myth of Targaryen invincibility died as well. Word would spread throughout Westeros and beyond, carrying with it the knowledge that dragons could be killed and their riders brought low. The age of easy conquest was over, and a new chapter in the history of power had begun. The silence that followed the fall of Meraxes seemed to stretch across the entire known world, as if the very foundations of reality had shifted and everything needed time to settle into new patterns. In the crater where the great silver dragon lay broken, Princess Meria Martell stood motionless for long moments, her ancient eyes taking in the fulfillment of prophecies that had been spoken before her birth. At 82 years of age, she had lived to see the impossible made manifest, the seemingly invincible brought low by the patient application of knowledge that had been 4 centuries in the gathering. The death of Queen Rhaenys came not from any single arrow or spear thrust, but from the accumulated trauma of witnessing her dragon's destruction. The bond between rider and mount was more than mere emotional attachment. It was a mystical connection that shared not only thoughts and feelings, but life force itself. When Meraxes died, a part of Rhaenys died with her, the shock of severed connection proving more devastating than any physical wound. Around the fallen dragon, the combined forces of the Dornish resistance began the solemn task of documenting their victory for posterity. Scholars who had spent years studying dragon anatomy examined Meraxes' body with the reverent attention of researchers confirming theoretical knowledge through practical observation. The weapons that had brought her down were carefully recovered and preserved, destined to become the foundation of a new understanding of how dragons could be fought and defeated. Yet even as they celebrated their unprecedented triumph, the Dornish leadership understood that they had achieved something far more significant than mere military victory. They had shattered the psychological foundations upon which Targaryen rule rested, proving beyond doubt that dragons were mortal creatures whose weaknesses could be exploited by sufficiently determined enemies. The implications would ripple throughout Westeros and beyond, calling into question the entire structure of power that Aegon the Conqueror had established. News of the catastrophe reached Lord Orys at Euronwood within hours, carried by ravens whose messages painted a picture of unprecedented disaster. The death of Queen Rhaenys represented not merely the loss of a royal family member, but the destruction of 1/3 of the Targaryen military capability. More devastating still was the psychological impact of the defeat, the knowledge that dragons could be systematically hunted and killed by enemies who possessed the proper knowledge and equipment. The strategic implications were immediate and far-reaching. The Targaryen forces in Dorne found themselves suddenly isolated in hostile territory, their supply lines vulnerable to attack by enemies who had proven capable of destroying even their most powerful weapons. Morale collapsed as news of the disaster spread through the ranks, with many soldiers questioning whether their cause was hopeless against enemies who possessed such devastating capabilities. Yet the broader consequences extended far beyond the immediate military situation in Dorne. Throughout the Seven Kingdoms, lords who had submitted to Targaryen rule out of fear rather than conviction began to reconsider their positions. If dragons could be killed, if even Queen Rhaenys herself could be brought low by determined resistance, then perhaps the new order was not as permanent as it had appeared. King Aegon's response to his sister-wife's death revealed the depths of his emotional and strategic dependence on the Targaryen dragons. The man who had conquered 6 kingdoms in 2 years found himself paralyzed by grief and uncertainty, unable to contemplate the prospect of continuing the war without one of his most trusted allies and most powerful weapons. For weeks after receiving the news, he remained secluded in the Red Keep, refusing to meet with advisors or make decisions about the ongoing campaign. The political ramifications were equally severe. The other kingdoms had accepted Targaryen rule, partly because resistance seemed futile in the face of overwhelming dragon power. The death of Meraxes and her rider demonstrated that this power was not absolute, that even the mightiest dragons could be brought down by enemies who possessed sufficient knowledge and determination. Whispers of rebellion began to circulate in taverns and castle halls throughout Westeros, as lords contemplated the possibility that Targaryen rule might not be permanent after all. Princess Meria, however, understood that military victory was only the beginning of a much larger struggle. The death of Queen Rhaenys had proven that dragons could be killed, but it had also guaranteed that King Aegon would never again underestimate Dornish resistance. The remaining 2 dragons, Balerion and Vhagar, were larger and more powerful than Meraxes had been, and their riders would be prepared for the kinds of weapons and tactics that had brought down their sister. More importantly, the Dornish victory had transformed the nature of the conflict from a regional rebellion into a civilization-wide struggle. The techniques and knowledge that had killed Meraxes would inevitably spread to other enemies of Targaryen rule, creating new centers of resistance throughout the known world. The Iron Bank of Braavos, the free cities, and even discontented lords within Westeros itself would seek to acquire the dragon-killing weapons and knowledge that Dorne had developed. The resolution of the immediate crisis came through negotiations that neither side had anticipated before the battle at Hellhold. King Aegon, devastated by his personal loss and faced with the prospect of indefinite warfare against enemies who had proven capable of killing dragons, proved surprisingly amenable to diplomatic solutions. Princess Meria Martell, serving as her mother's representative, entered into discussions that would eventually lead to formal recognition of Dornish independence in exchange for ceremonial acknowledgement of Targaryen sovereignty. The Peace of Sunspear, as historians would later call it, represented a compromise that satisfied neither side completely but allowed both to claim victory. Dorne would remain independent, free to maintain its own laws and customs without interference from King's Landing. In return, the Martells would acknowledge Aegon as their overlord in ceremonial matters and provide limited military support in times of external threat to the Seven Kingdoms. Yet the true significance of the peace treaty lay not in its specific terms, but in what it represented. For the first time since beginning his conquest, Aegon had been forced to accept something less than total submission from one of the Seven Kingdoms. The precedent established by Dornish resistance would inspire future generations of rebels and would-be conquerors, proving that even the mightiest empires could be forced to negotiate with sufficiently determined enemies. The death of Meraxes also had profound implications for the Targaryen dynasty's long-term survival. The loss of one dragon significantly reduced their military capability, but more importantly, it demonstrated that their power was finite and vulnerable. Future Targaryen rulers would need to govern through means other than pure intimidation, developing political skills and diplomatic relationships that their predecessors had been able to ignore. The knowledge that had killed the Silver Dragon did not remain confined to Dorne for long. Within months of the battle at Hellhold, reports began arriving of dragon-killing weapons appearing throughout the free cities, and even in distant Slavers Bay. The Iron Bank of Bravos proved particularly interested in acquiring such capabilities, viewing them as essential insurance against potential Targaryen aggression in the future. Perhaps most significantly, the techniques developed by the Dornish resistance began to influence military thinking throughout the known world. The concept of asymmetric warfare, of using superior knowledge and preparation to overcome seemingly insurmountable advantages, became a subject of study in military academies from Norvos to Volantis. The age of easy conquest through superior technology was ending, replaced by a more complex understanding of how power could be challenged and overcome. Princess Meria did not live to see the full implications of her victory unfold. The strain of coordinating the massive resistance effort had taken its toll on her ancient body, and she died peacefully in her sleep less than a year after the battle at Hellhold. Yet her legacy lived on in the knowledge and techniques that had brought down Meraxes, ensuring that future generations would remember that even dragons were mortal and could be defeated by enemies who possessed sufficient determination and wisdom. The resolution of the Dornish Wars thus marked not just the end of a particular conflict, but the beginning of a new age in the history of Westeros and the wider world. The myth of Targaryen invincibility had been shattered forever, replaced by a more complex understanding of power and resistance that would shape politics and warfare for generations to come. In the wastes of Dorne, where ancient Rhoynar wisdom had finally claimed its revenge against the legacy of Valyria, the future had been fundamentally altered by the patient application of knowledge that had been 4 centuries in the making. The Silver Dragon lay buried beneath the desert sands, but the memory of her fall would endure as long as humans told stories of how the mighty could be brought low and how ancient grievances could finally find their resolution in the fullness of time. In the years that followed the great battle at Hellhold, the desert winds carried new stories across the red sands of Dorne, where once they had whispered of coming war and ancient preparations. Now they spoke of healing and renewal, of a land that had paid the ultimate price for its freedom and emerged transformed by the experience. The crater where Meraxes fell became a place of pilgrimage, not for conquest or glory, but for reflection on the true cost of independence and the weight of choices that echo through generations. Princess Meria Martell, who had inherited her mother's throne and the burden of Dorne's hard-won sovereignty, often walked the battlements of Sunspear in the cool hours before dawn. At 50 years of age, she bore the marks of a ruler who had seen the world change in fundamental ways, her face lined with the wisdom that comes only from witnessing history, pivot on the actions of individuals who dared to dream the impossible. The peace that settled over Dorne was different from the silence that had preceded the war. Where once the quiet had been pregnant with gathering tension, now it held the deep contentment of a land that had proven its worth to itself and to the world. The hidden strongholds beneath the desert gradually transformed from military installations into centers of learning, where the knowledge that had defeated dragons was preserved and studied not for future warfare, but for the understanding of how human determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The water gardens of Sunspear bloomed more beautifully than they had in generations, tended by gardeners who worked with the patient satisfaction of those who knew their homeland would remain free for their children and their children's children. The ancient Rhoynar techniques for managing water in the desert, once preserved as military secrets, now flourished openly as agricultural innovations that made the most barren lands productive. Children born after the war grew up in a Dorne that was fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. These young Dornish learned the stories of the Great Resistance not as preparation for their own battles, but as lessons about the power of unity, patience, and the careful preservation of knowledge across generations. They practiced archery and horsemanship not because dragons might come again, but because these skills connected them to their heritage and reminded them of what their ancestors had accomplished. In the markets of Sunspear and Lemonwood, merchants from across the known world came to trade not just in spices and silks, but in ideas and innovations. The reputation that Dorne had earned for defeating the impossible brought scholars and engineers from the free cities, all eager to learn from the people who had proven that even dragons could be brought low by human ingenuity and determination. The relationship between Dorne and the rest of Westeros evolved into something unprecedented in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. King Aegon, aged by grief and chastened by his losses, proved to be a different ruler than the conqueror who had first set foot on Westerosi soil. The death of his sister wife had taught him that power based solely on fear was ultimately fragile, and he began the slow work of building legitimacy through justice and competent governance rather than intimidation. The diplomatic correspondence between Sunspear and King's Landing reflected this new reality. Letters exchanged between Princess Meria and King Aegon spoke not of submission and dominance, but of mutual respect between sovereign rulers who understood the costs of warfare and the value of peace. Trade agreements replaced military ultimatums, and cultural exchanges began to bridge the gap between Dornish and Targaryen worldviews. Other kingdoms throughout Westeros watched this relationship with fascination and sometimes envy. The precedent established by Dornish independence had profound implications for how power was understood and exercised throughout the realm. Lords who had bent the knee out of fear began to consider what genuine partnership with their Targaryen overlords might look like, leading to negotiations and accommodations that made the Seven Kingdoms stronger and more stable than pure conquest ever could have achieved. The legacy of Queen Rhaenys evolved in unexpected ways as the years passed. Rather than being remembered simply as a fallen conqueror, she became a figure of tragic heroism, a warrior who had faced an impossible challenge with courage and had paid the ultimate price for her family's ambitions. Songs sung in taverns throughout Westeros spoke not of her defeat but of her bravery, and even in Dorne, poets acknowledged the nobility of her sacrifice. The techniques that had brought down Meraxes were never used again in anger. Princess Meria made the conscious decision to share the knowledge freely with other kingdoms that faced threats from would-be conquerors, transforming what had been weapons of war into tools of deterrence that helped maintain peace throughout the known world. The very existence of anti-dragon capabilities made dragon riders more cautious and diplomatic in their dealings with others, creating a balance of power that served everyone's interests. Maester chroniclers in the Citadel wrote extensively about the lessons of the Dornish Wars, documenting not just the military innovations, but the philosophical and political insights that had emerged from the conflict. Their text became required reading for future rulers and advisors, ensuring that the knowledge gained through such terrible cost would not be forgotten or ignored. In the deeper chambers beneath Sunspear, where the ancient Rhoynar archives were still maintained, scholars from across the known world came to study the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had learned to resist oppression through patience and preparation. These repositories of knowledge became centers of learning that attracted the greatest minds of the age, fostering innovations in everything from agriculture to astronomy. Princess Meria's grave in the crypts of Sunspear became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who sought to understand how individual determination could change the course of history. Visitors often left small offerings of desert flowers, the same blooms that had once carried messages between resistance fighters, now symbols of the beauty that could emerge from the most barren circumstances. The dragons that survived the war, Balerion and Vhagar, lived their remaining years in a world forever changed by their sister's death. Their riders treated them with greater care and respect, understanding that the bond between human and dragon was precious partly because it was fragile. The age of casual dragon deployment was over, replaced by a more thoughtful approach to when and how such power should be exercised. As the sun set over the summer sea and painted the ancient walls of Sunspear in shades of gold and crimson, Princess Meria often reflected on the strange paths that had led to this peaceful conclusion. Her mother's laughter in the face of Aegon's ultimatum had seemed like defiant madness to many observers, but it had been rooted in a deep understanding of human nature and the long arc of historical justice. The desert winds that evening carried no whispers of war or hints of gathering storm. Instead, they spoke of children playing in the water gardens, of merchants haggling in the markets, of scholars debating in the libraries, and of farmers tending crops that would feed future generations of free Dornish. The silence was no longer pregnant with possibility, but full with fulfillment, the deep contentment of a people who had proven that freedom was worth any price and that human dignity could never be permanently conquered. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The same stars that had guided Princess Meria's ships across the narrow sea 1,000 years before, the same stars that had watched over the patient preparation of resistance through centuries of exile and planning. They shone down now on a dawn that was truly free, where ancient promises had been kept and ancient grievances had found their resolution in the fullness of time. In the gentle darkness of the desert night, where the sands held the memory of all who had walked upon them, the story of the Dornish Wars found its peaceful ending. Not in conquest or submission, but in the understanding that true victory lies not in dominating others, but in remaining true to one's deepest principles, no matter how impossible the odds may seem. The silver dragon slept beneath the sands, but her death had given birth to something far more precious than any conquest. It had proven that in the end the human spirit, properly prepared and patiently applied, could overcome any tyranny and any weapon, no matter how terrible or magnificent it might appear. And in that knowledge, the people of Dorne found a peace deeper than any sword could provide, a security that no wall could offer, and a freedom that no conqueror could ever take away.